right, how is everyone doing today? Sunday. Sunday, reading day, study day, capital day. We only have 1,100 pages to get through. Only 1,100 pages. We're going to speed right through it. You're not even going to notice. And we are starting today with Chapter 1. Part 1, Chapter 1, Commodities and Money. So we will start with the commodity form. So it's going to be painful. It's going to be, as Marx adverted in the various prefaces that we went through last time. It can be a difficult climb to the heights of science, but we've got to do it. You got to do it somehow. And I figured always good to reread Capital, and going to reread Capital together with all of you here who are here to witness it. I think we're just gonna plunge right in here. Let's bring it down to Chapter 1, the commodity. So this part, we're going to go bit by bit. As always, we're going to make some mistakes. We're going to misread some things. There are always new things to understand and read, especially with a book as hefty and as dense as this one. So yeah, we've got a long road to go. So I think we'll just jump right into it. Chapter 1, the commodity. The two factors of the commodity: use value and value, substance of value, magnitude of value. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. So, as kind of said, he's starting with what Marx defines as the cell form of capitalist mode of production. And that involves diving into a fairly deep level of abstraction to understand that. So we're going to begin with that, and we're going to follow through the analysis here as best we can. The commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing which through its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. Nor does it matter here how the thing satisfies man's need, whether directly as a means of subsistence, i.e. an object of consumption, or indirectly as a means of production. So right from the start, Marx is already quite ahead of his time in considering the commodity as, something that he's already laying out, the basis for human needs that go beyond, basic human reproduction, human survival. He's already pointing to needs which can be of the imagination, and, looking at our historical epic today, just as a fork or a bowl or a computer can be a commodity, so too we have digital commodities, we have services that have been constructed as commodities. All sorts of, basically, commodity here is anything that satisfies a human need of whatever kind, as he puts it there. Every useful thing, for example, iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. Every useful thing is a whole composed of many properties. It can therefore be useful in various ways. The discovery of these ways, and hence of the manifold uses of things, is the work of history. Here we can go to some of these footnotes. Things have an intrinsic virtue. This is Barbin's special term for use value, which in all places have the same virtue. As the lodestone to attract iron, the magnet's property of attracting iron only became useful once it had led to this discovery of magnetic polarity. So again, he's talking, here he's talking about history, and with that, the history of invention, of technological progress, the different discoveries of how we can use these things to satisfy our needs, at which point, having discovered how they can satisfy a need or having created a new need, then, there is a need for that, and it can be, under the capitalist mode of production, made into a commodity of one form or another. So also is the invention of socially recognized standards of measurement for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of the measures for commodities arises in part from the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, and in part from convention. The usefulness of a thing makes it a use value. Here we will go to the footnote. There are many of these which will break things up. The natural worth of anything consists in its fitness to supply the necessities or serve the conveniences of human life. John Locke, Some Considerations on the Consequences of the Lowering of Interest, 1691. In Works, London, 1777. In English writers of the 17th century, we still often find the word worth used for use value and value for exchange value. This is in quite accordance with the spirit of a language that likes to use a Teutonic word for the actual thing and a Romance word for its reflection. So also have some buried gems within the footnotes, which is why we have to dive into them every time they come up. Again, returning, the usefulness of a thing makes it a use value, but this usefulness does not dangle in midair. It is conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity and has no existence apart from the latter. It is therefore the physical body of the commodity itself. Sorry, my cat wants to join in the reading. It is therefore the physical body of the commodity itself, for instance, iron, corn, a diamond, which is the use value or useful thing. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When examining use values, we always assume we are dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen. There's going to be a lot of yards of linen coming up. There's going to be a lot of discussion of linen. Get ready. If you're a fan of linen, this is a book for you. Yards of linen or tons of iron. The use values of commodities provide the material for a special branch of knowledge, namely the commercial knowledge of commodities. In bourgeois society, the legal fiction prevails that each person, as a buyer, has an encyclopedic knowledge of commodities. This is, of course, a legal fiction, but Marx is going to go along with the sort of rules of capitalism as it is envisioned, as it works theoretically, and develop out of that. The use values of commodities provide the material for a special branch of knowledge, namely the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values are only realized, verwirklicht, in use or in consumption. They constitute the material content of wealth, whatever its social form may be. In the form of society to be considered here, they are also the material bearers of exchange value. So here we already have introduced one of the first big distinctions that Marx is going to make between use value and exchange value. Use value is, as explained here, the usefulness of a thing, the need it satisfies, whether that need be to the end consumer, or whether that need ends up consumed as part of producing another product, but it is the aspect of the object that is actually used effectively, that is actually consumed and forms one of our needs. Now, Marx is going to turn to exchange value, which is a quite different thing, related, obviously. Exchange value appears first of all as the quantitative relation, the proportion in which use values of one kind exchange for use values of another kind. Here he brings a quote from the Physiocrats. Value consists in the exchange relation between one thing and another, between a given amount of one product and a given amount of another. This relation changes constantly with time and place. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e. an exchange value that is inseparably connected with the commodity inherent in it, seems a contradiction in terms. Let us consider the matter more closely. Here he quotes another classical economist, nothing can have an intrinsic value, Barbon. Or as Butler says, the value of a thing is just as much as it will bring. A given commodity, a quarter of wheat, for example, is exchanged for X boot polish, Y silk, or Z gold, etc. In short, it is exchanged for other commodities in the most diverse proportions. Therefore, the wheat has many exchange values instead of one. X boot polish, Y silk, or Z gold, etc. each represent the exchange value of 1/4 of wheat. Therefore, X boot polish, Y silk, Z gold, etc. must, as exchange values, be mutually replaceable or of identical magnitude. It follows from this that, firstly, the valid exchange values of a particular commodity express something equal, and secondly, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the form of appearance, of a content distinguishable from it. So here, he's sort of going from the individual commodities to obviously how they begin to relate to another, how they can be exchanged. And the work here is going to be diving into that and discovering, okay, why can they be exchanged? Obviously, they're silk or boot polish or gold are all fundamentally very different from each other. So how is it that human societies are then ultimately able to relate, these things that are qualitatively extremely different, that fulfill extremely different needs? How are we then able to relate them to each other and come to rules around which we begin to exchange them? Let us now take two commodities. For example, corn and iron. Whatever their exchange relation may be, it can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For instance, 1/4 of corn equals X CWT of iron. I'm not actually sure what exact measurement CWT here would be. But it's not essential here. What does this equation signify? It signifies that a common element of identical magnitude exists in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and similarly in X CWT of iron. Both are therefore equal to a third thing, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third thing. So again, you have two qualitatively different things. They can be exchanged one for another, so they must have something else that makes that exchangeability possible. And in that way, it's something that each can be effectively reduced to. A simple geometrical example will illustrate this. In order to determine and compare the areas of all rectilinear figures, we split them up into triangles. Then the triangle itself is reduced to an expression totally different from its visible shape, half the product of the base and the altitude. In the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be reduced to a common element of which they represent a greater or a lesser quantity. So here, Marx is bringing up a math example. Compare the areas of all rectilinear figures, we split them up into triangles. So again, it's how, within a mathematical measurement, how you have a more complex shape, you break it up into, less complex shapes and are able to, then determine the measurements based off of that, based off of its kind of component parts. And this is obviously an allegory that Marx is drawing out, to understand how this exchange value is this sort of common element, this underlying element between the different commodities that allows them to be compared and to effectively be measured. However, this common element cannot be a geometrical, physical, chemical, or other natural property of commodities. Such properties come into consideration only to the extent that they make the commodities useful, i.e., turn them into use values. But clearly, the exchange relation of commodities is characterized precisely by its abstraction from their use values. Within the exchange relation, one use value is worth just as much as another, provided only that it is present in the appropriate quantity. Or, as old Barbon says, one sort of wares are as good as another if the value be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is of as great a value as 100 pounds worth of silver and gold. As use values, commodities differ above all in quality, while as exchange values, they can only differ in quantity, and therefore do not contain an atom of use value. So here, again, these different objects, which are qualitatively very different, share this in common, share this exchange value in common, which we are trying to diagnose and understand here. If then we disregard the use values of commodities, only one property remains, that of being products of labor. But even the product of labor has already been transformed in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use value, we abstract also from the material constituents and forms which make it a use value. It is no longer a table, a house, a piece of yarn, or any other useful thing. All its sensuous characteristics are extinguished. Nor is it any longer the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, or the spinner, or of any other particular kind of productive labor. With the disappearance of the useful character of the products of labor, the useful character of the kinds of labor embodied in them also disappears. This in turn entails the disappearance of the different concrete forms of labor. They can no longer be distinguished, but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract. So here we have Marx, developing what are the implications of this exchange value as well, because similar to how each object has its own different use value and in the way in which it's composed physically and the needs it meets and all of that. So too does the labor that goes into it. It's quite different, the labor that goes into, whittling a piece of wood together compared to, the labor that goes into ironworking or painting a Warhammer miniature or, all these different things are very different processes. There's not a clear continuity in those acts of labor in the same way as there's not in a similar way that there's not a clear continuity in the qualities of these different objects that they have that are then reduced to X amount of exchange value. But in being reduced to exchange value and in all the products of labor being reduced to a certain amount of exchange value, there's also a commonality of human labor that is created in that process as well. There's this creation of what he talks about here. They can no longer be distinguished, but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract. So it's this consolidation of the commodity form that is also creating this human labor in the abstract itself as something that has the same kind of tangibility and reality as exchange value does. Let us now look at the residue of the products of labor. There is nothing left of them in each case but the same phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, i.e., human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended to produce them. Human labor is accumulated in them. As crystals of the social substance, which is common to them all, they are values, commodity values. We have seen that when commodities are in the relation of exchange, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value, as it has just been defined. The common factor in the exchange relation, or in the exchange value of the commodity, is therefore its value. The progress of the investigation will lead us back to exchange value as the necessary mode of expression, or form of appearance, of value. For the present, however, we must consider the nature of value independently of its form of appearance. So again, here Marx is kind of, diving into levels of abstraction, then pull back. There are also a number of things that he's not developing yet, which will become important. I mention this because sometimes there are critics of Marx who read like the first 8 pages and they're like, oh, wait, no, but he doesn't talk about that. He doesn't talk about socially necessary labor time. He will talk about socially necessary labor time. He will talk about all of these components that build out of this to make it understandable and tangible to us. But it's not immediate. He has to sort of start from the high levels of abstraction to then sort of build on top of that. Sorry, my dog it's going crazy in the background. Come here, Katya. Katya. What happened? Okay, we're back. Sorry, my dog. Okay, here we are. Apologies about that. Someone has a lot of energy. There's a dog here with a lot of energy, and too many loud bottles for them to make noise on. All right, returning to the text. We have seen that when commodities are in the relation of exchange, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we extract from their use value, there remains their value, as it has just been defined. The common factor in the exchange relation, or in the exchange value of the commodity, is therefore its value. So yeah, he's going to explain the value itself that lies behind this exchange value, and that's basically where we're going next here. A use value, or useful article, therefore, has value only because abstract human labor is objectified, or materialized in it. How, then, is the magnitude of this value to be measured? By means of the quantity of the value-forming substance, the labor, contained in the article. This quantity is measured by its duration, and the labor time is itself measured on a particular scale of hours, days, etc. So here, what is behind this value? It is the human labor that goes into it. It might seem that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor expended to produce it, it would be the more valuable, the more unskillful and lazy the worker who produced it, because he would need more time to complete the article. Again, here Marx is already, this is what, our 1, 2, 3, 4, this is the 5th page. This is the 5th page of Capital, and Marx is already addressing, the standard kind of anti-Marxist arguments that you hear lazy right-wing people come up with, and it just shows you anytime you run into those that those people have not actually engaged with the argument, because Marx addresses many of those arguments here, right now, in the very first pages of his most important work. It might seem that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor expended to produce it, it would be the more valuable, the more unskillful and lazy the worker who produced it, because he would need more time to complete the article. However, the labor that forms the substance of value is equal human labor, the expenditure of identical human labor power. The total labor power of society, which is manifested in the values of the world of commodities, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power. although composed of innumerable individual units of labor power. Each of these units is the same as any other, to the extent that it has the character of a socially average unit of labor power and acts as such, i.e., only needs, in order to produce a commodity, the labor time which is necessary on an average, or in other words, is socially necessary. Socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. The introduction of power looms into England, for example, probably reduced by 1/2 the labor required to convert a given quantity of yarn into woven fabric. In order to do this, the English hand loom weaver in fact needed the same amount of labor time as before, but the product of his individual hour of labor now only represented half an hour of social labor and consequently fell to 1/2 its former value. So yeah, here you have already addressed like the most common argument that people shout out against the what's called the labor theory of value. And here he's addressing that, no, we're not talking about, it's not that X random person is going to work X hours and then that thing is worth X compared to, the other person who is able to do it much faster, much quicker. We're dealing with labor at an abstracted level and at a level that is abstracted from society, that forms that essentially forms an average through society, and which is also one that as technology and as the mode of production develops and advances and there's more machinery, more advances in the productivity of labor, all of those things are going to push forward the productivity of labor. And so it means that there will also be less value contained in each individual product of that. When the machinery makes it possible to produce twice as many fidgets, in the same amount of time, they contain half as much labor. They contain half as much value because it's the human labor that goes into that is forming the value. And this is human labor that is determined on a social scale, which obviously leaves room for, someone who is extremely efficient can get more than, the value of their labor. Someone who is less efficient is getting, less out of their time that they're putting into labor. And these things are averaged, basically across society as a whole, even as they're being pushed forward by, certain advances in productivity on certain sectors based off of, the growth and competition within the capitalist mode of production itself. But all of that is forming and interacting on a scale essentially across human society, across all the society that is incorporated into the capitalist mode of production. And the value of the labor is determined within that. So again, we're talking about labor on a social scale, labor on a human scale. It's not that we're just, comparing, I dig a hole really badly with a spoon and then someone else digs a hole with a shovel. Between those, there is an average form that then becomes, what is the social productivity of labor. And obviously that creates its own pressures within it for, more productive forms of labor and more productive technologies that enable labor to then be adapted and to generalize across society. What exclusively, let me scroll down a bit here for you all. What exclusively determines the magnitude of the value of any article is therefore the amount of labor socially necessary or the labor time socially necessary for its production. Here we have the note. The value of them, the necessaries of life, when they're exchanged the one for another, is regulated by the quantity of labor necessarily required and commonly taken in producing them. Some thoughts on the interest of money in general, and particularly in the public funds, London. This remarkable anonymous work of the 18th century bears no date. However, it is clear from its content that it appeared in the reign of George II. The individual commodity counts here only as an average sample of its kind. Properly speaking, all products of the same kind form a single mass, and their price is determined in general and without regard to particular circumstances. Here, Marx is citing Le Trosne from another older work of economics. Commodities which contain equal quantities of labor, or which can be produced in the same time, have therefore the same value. The value of a commodity is related to the value of any other commodity, as the labor time necessary for the production of the one is related to the labor time necessary for the production of the other. As exchange values, all commodities are merely definite quantities of congealed labor time. Here, and Marx is citing himself. The value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. But the latter changes with every variation in the productivity of labor. Here, Marx is diving into, as we mentioned, these innovations in productivity of labor push forward and, will transform the value of commodities and the value of the labor going into them. But the latter changes with every variation in the productivity of labor. This is determined by a wide range of circumstances. It is determined, amongst other things, by the worker's average degree of skill, the level of development of science and its technological application, the social organization of the process of production, the extent and effectiveness of the means of production, and the conditions found in the natural environment. For example, the same quantity of labor is present in 8 bushels of corn in favorable seasons and in only 4 bushels in unfavorable seasons. The same quantity of labor provides more metal in rich mines than in poor. Diamonds are a very rare occurrence on the Earth's surface, and hence their discovery costs, on an average, a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small volume. Jacob questions whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. Here he cites William Jacob, An Historical Inquiry into the Production and Consumption of Precious Metals. This applies still more to diamonds. According to Eschwege, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond mines for the 80 years ending in 1823 still did not amount to the price of 1.5 years' average produce of the sugar and coffee plantations of the same country. Although the diamonds represented much more labor, therefore more value. With richer mines, the same quantity of labor would be embodied in more diamonds and their value would fall. If man succeeded, without much labor, in transforming carbon into diamonds, their value might fall below that of bricks. Obviously, we are now at a point where we can transform carbon into diamonds. Not quite at the level for their value to fall below that of bricks, but we have considerably reduced the value of diamonds, of course, despite marketing and monopoly efforts to preserve certain value around a so-called real diamond and all of those things, which are essentially efforts to construct and maintain a kind of differentiation and a kind of monopoly aspect to products that are being sold. But those are sort of things that then emerge based off of they emerge on top of this mode of production we're living in. But Marx is analyzing the underlying aspects, the fundamentals. So, obviously he's not going to discuss the significant efforts by the De Beers Corporation to preserve their monopoly over diamonds. And obviously the value isn't below that of bricks. It requires a lot of energy to transform carbon into diamonds. But you can see that in many ways this is a remarkably prescient, like much of Capital and Marx's work is very prescient, but a remarkable prescient discussion of something that would happen with diamonds eventually. In general, the greater the productivity of labor, the less the labor time required to produce an article, the less the mass of labor crystallized in that article, and the less its value. Inversely, the less the productivity of labor, the greater the labor time necessary to produce an article, and the greater its value. The value of a commodity, therefore, varies directly as the quantity and inversely as the productivity of the labor which finds its realization within the commodity. Now we know the substance of value. It is labor. We know the measure of its magnitude. It is labor time. The form, which stamps value as exchange value, remains to be analyzed. But before this, we need to develop the characteristics we have already found somewhat more fully. A thing can be a use value without being a value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is not mediated through labor. Air, virgin soil, natural meadows, unplanted forests, etc. fall into this category. A thing can be useful and a product of human labor without being a commodity. He who satisfies his own need with the product of his own labor admittedly creates use values, but not commodities. In order to produce the latter, he must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values, and not merely for others. The medieval peasant produced a corn rent for the feudal lord and a corn tithe for the priest, but neither the corn rent nor the corn tithe became commodities simply by being produced for others. In order to become a commodity, the product must be transferred to the other person, for whom it serves as a use value through the medium of exchange. Finally, nothing can be a value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. So again, if you expend labor uselessly, it doesn't, it's not going to magically create value on that useless thing. They have to be, the labor has to be expended on a need, and the commodity here is something that is produced as part of the process of exchange. So it's talking about, in previous modes of production, here he's talking about the situation of peasants who, would pay certain amounts in corn rent to the lord or the priest. It's not transformed into a commodity because it's not entering into, broader market exchange. Their own labor is going into sustaining themselves in relationship to the earth and to all these various things which do not actually require human labor. Obviously, those things can change. For example, if the capitalists succeed in creating a dystopian future of capitalism throughout the solar system, you may well have to pay for air on Mars or, off the moons of Jupiter or wherever it may be, because their air would become a product of labor, a product that has to be produced through immense expenses of labor, and suddenly it's not something that is free and available to all, but it is something that is then controlled and sold. And obviously, Marx will address this more in some of the historical portions, but obviously we're at a point where, no longer is there virgin soil, natural meadows, unplanted forests that you can just go to and enjoy the fruits of for your own use value. We are now at a point of the dominance of capitalist relations of production where those later examples are just not really a thing anymore. But yeah, let's continue here. And again, nothing can be a value without being an object of utility. So, commodities have to have a use value there eventually to retain that value of the labor that was put into them. And if they cease to have a use value, then they no longer contain that value. That value is effectively destroyed. And that value can be partially destroyed or is always partially destroyed as long as there is technological progress driving forward the productivity of labor. So, assuming it will be more productive to produce things in the future, which is, usually the case as technological production advances and as it's structured within a system that forces it to advance quite quickly. Anything that sits there as a commodity is going to be, it was produced under past methods and a past measure of socially necessary labor time that is going to be compared to a future one where, less human labor value is embodied in it. So, you have to sell quickly to get the full value back from that. All right. The dual character of the labor embodied in commodities. Initially, the commodity appeared to us as an object with a dual character, possessing both use value and exchange value. Later on, it was seen that labor too has a dual character. Insofar as it finds its expression in value, it no longer possesses the same characteristics as when it is the creator of use values. I was the first to point out and examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities. As this point is crucial to an understanding of political economy, it requires further elucidation. So again, here he's pointing out, again, Marx is not the originator of, the idea that labor constitutes the value of commodities or the ultimate measure of value. He's drawing off of previous traditions of political economy that developed this idea, but he is the inventor of this sort of dual character of that labor, which we will explore in more depth here. Let us take two commodities, such as a coat and 10 yards of linen. By the way, coats and linen come up all the time, and partly it is because Marx, as he was writing this, was constantly taking his coat to the pawn shop and then getting money from the pawn shop to pay rent, pay the groceries, till Engels could give him some more money. Then he would come back and pick up the coat once he had money again, and inevitably would have to pawn it or whatever it was, the curtains, the drapes. So there was a constant cycle of circulation of his own coat. So he was very familiar with the circulation of coats and linen, which adds a nice little historical note to why he chose to talk about linen and coats so much. That it's a bit of a joke within Marxist circles that you're just going to spend the day talking about bolts of linen. Let us take two commodities, such as a coat and 10 yards of linen, and let the value of the first be twice the value of the second, so that if 10 yards of linen equals W, the coat is equal to 2W. The coat is a use value that satisfies a particular need. A specific kind of productive activity is required to bring it into existence. This activity is determined by its aim, mode of operation, object, means, and result. We use the abbreviated expression useful labor for labor whose utility is represented by the use value of its product, or by the fact that its product is a use value. In this connection, we consider only its useful effect. As the coat and the linen are qualitatively different use values, so also are the forms of labor through which their existence is mediated, tailoring and weaving. If the use values were not qualitatively different, hence not the products of qualitatively different forms of useful labor, they would be absolutely incapable of confronting each other as commodities. Coats cannot be exchanged for coats. One use value cannot be exchanged for another of the same kind. So here, again, bringing up the differential use value character of the labor that goes into two quite different acts of labor. And so, well, they must have, some sort of central socially determined commonality. The totality of heterogeneous use values or physical commodities reflects a totality of similarly heterogeneous forms of useful labor, which differ in order, genus, species, and variety. In short, a social division of labor. This division of labor is a necessary condition for commodity production, although the converse does not hold. Commodity production is not a necessary condition for the social division of labor. Labor is socially divided in the primitive Indian community, although the products do not thereby become commodities. Or, to take an example nearer home, labor is systematically divided in every factory, but the workers do not bring about this division by exchanging their individual products. Only the products of mutually independent acts of labor performed in isolation can confront each other as commodities. To sum up then, the use value of every commodity contains useful labor, i.e. productive activity of a definite kind carried on with a definite aim. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor contained in them is qualitatively different in each case. In a society whose products generally assume the form of commodities, i.e. in a society of commodity producers, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor which are carried on independently and privately by individual producers develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. So here, talking about this kind of development out of exchange and the importance that, it's not just the division of labor that creates this commodity, this differentiation labor. For example, here, obviously in a previous time he's talking about Indian communities. We are not necessarily the terminology we would use today, but under various older forms of production, there was a social division of labor. Certain people would specialize in, they might specialize in primitive aspects of agriculture, or they might specialize in hunting, or they might specialize in the labor that goes into maintaining the fire. But all of that was kind of producing immediate use values for the community in whole. And it's not that, that then entered into a mini marketplace where people were, exchanging one against another. Hi, puppy. Yes, we have several puppies here. Let us take a quick break to greet the animals. We have Pancake. Pancake provides lots of free use value of cuteness. We also have Katya. Katya, let's see if I can get her up. Oh, what? Just makes it. She doesn't like to be stood up with. There we go. It's a big dog. Katya's a big dog and very energetic right now. She is chasing her own tail. A very dog. Likes to chase the tail, likes to, gets a lot of use value out of sticks, but there's no labor that goes into sticks. So it obviously, sticks, they just fall off the tree. And so, they're not there as commodities. No real human labor goes into them. So it's just enjoying free use values. And finally, noisiest one is Boom Boom. She's always here for the streams, but she usually is like sitting on my lap, just below the main camera angle. All right. It is, moreover, a matter of indifference whether the coat is worn by the tailor or by his customer. In both cases, it acts as a use value. So too, the relation between the coat and the labor that produced it is not in itself altered when tailoring becomes a special trade, an independent branch of the social division of labor. Men made clothes for thousands of years under the compulsion of the need for clothing without a single man ever becoming a tailor. But the existence of coats, of linen, of every element of material wealth not provided in advance by nature, had always to be mediated through a specific productive activity appropriate to its purpose, a productive activity that assimilated particular natural materials to particular human requirements. Labor, then, as the creator of use values, as useful labor, is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself. This last line here is also very important for some of the kind of later developments we've had in Marxism and Marxist theory around, man's relationship with nature as well. This talk of mediating the metabolism between man and nature. There's this kind of stereotype of Marxism as just being this purely productivist view of things that doesn't consider the natural world or the limits of the natural world. But Marx actually does have a number of areas where he reflects in more depth on this and on some of the historical crises that have emerged out of overexploitation of nature for our societies. And yeah, here he's talking about, there is this universal aspect to labor, and part of the interesting aspect of what has happened under the capitalist mode of production is that it has revealed the universal importance of labor as this fundamental element behind previous societies, and has left it in this more universal form of a commodity in which it can be analyzed and understood by us in a way that also reveals quite a lot about previous historical formations and previous societies, and allows us to examine them in a new way. Use values like coats, linen, etc., in short, the physical bodies of commodities, are combinations of two elements, the material provided by nature and labor. If we subtract the total amount of useful labor of different kinds which is contained in the coat, the linen, etc., a material substratum is always left. This substratum is furnished by nature without human intervention. When man engages in production, he can only proceed as nature does herself, i.e., he can only change the form of the materials. Here we have another footnote. All the phenomena of the universe, whether produced by the hand of man or indeed by the universal laws of physics, are not to be conceived of as acts of creation, but solely as a reordering of matter. Composition and separation are the only elements found by the human mind whenever it analyzes the notion of reproduction. And so it is with the reproduction of value. Use value, although Very himself in this polemic against the physiocrats is not quite certain of the kind of value he's referring to. Again, this is one of the many quotes Marx brings in from earlier political economists. And wealth, whether earth, air, and water are turned into corn in the fields, or the secretions of an insect are turned into silk by the hand of man, or some small pieces of metal are arranged together to form a repeating watch. And here he's quoting Very, Meditazione sulla economia politica. Furthermore, even in this work of modification, he is constantly helped by natural forces. Labor is therefore not the only source of material wealth, i.e., of the use values it produces. As William Petty says, labor is the father of material wealth, the earth is its mother. So again, Marx is emphasizing the importance of the natural world, and the role of labor within this within this schematic is basically labor is what transforms products of nature into another product of nature. Like all sort of matter of one kind or another is a product of nature, and we ourselves are products of nature. And the role of labor is then to act upon and transform that matter in one way. So we could perhaps do without the masculine feminine dichotomy here of labor is the father of material wealth, earth is the mother, labor all active, the mother all passive. But obviously, as we get to other aspects, or as we get to how it is discussed later, the labor involved in social reproduction, we will escape from some of those dichotomies borrowed, of course, from earlier political economists. Let us now pass from the commodity as an object of utility to the value of commodities. We have assumed that the coat is worth twice as much as the linen, but this is merely a quantitative difference and does not concern us at the moment. We shall therefore simply bear in mind that if the value of a coat is twice that of 10 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen will have the same value as a coat. As values, the coat and the linen have the same substance. They are the objective expressions of homogeneous labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different forms of labor. There are, however, states of society in which the same man alternately makes clothes and weaves. In this case, these two different modes of labor are only modifications of the labor of the same individual and not yet fixed functions peculiar to different individuals. Just as the coat our tailor makes today and the pair of trousers he makes tomorrow require him only to vary his own individual labor. Moreover, we can see at a glance that in our capitalist society, a given portion of labor is supplied alternately in the form of tailoring and in the form of weaving, in accordance with changes in the direction of the demand for labor. This change in the form of labor may well not take place without friction, but it must take place. So again, here talking about there are certain aspects that are common, or for example, there are forms of labor today which might be united in one sort of common function, but then they are broken up into different pieces. And this is something that has, happened many times throughout the history of capitalist mode of production in particular, as labor was specialized, as labor was reduced to its more simpler forms, so that it could then be done more cheaply, done more effectively, and sort of reduced to that kind of commonality. If we leave aside the determinate quality of productive activity, and therefore the useful character of the labor, what remains is its quality of being an expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving, although they are qualitatively different productive activities, are both a productive expenditure of human brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc., and in this sense both human labor. They are merely two different forms of the expenditure of human labor power. Of course, human labor power must itself have attained a certain level of development before it can be expended in this or that form. But the value of a commodity represents human labor pure and simple, the expenditure of human labor in general. And just as in civil society, a general or a banker plays a great part, but man as such plays a very mean part, so here too the same is true of human labor. It is the expenditure of simple labor power, i.e. of the labor power possessed in his bodily organism by every ordinary man, on the average, without being developed in any special way. Simple average labor, it is true, varies in character in different countries and at different cultural epochs, but in a particular society it is given. More complex labor counts only as intensified or rather multiplied simple labor, so that a smaller quantity of complex labor is considered equal to a larger quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. A commodity may be the outcome of the most complicated labor, but through its value, it is posited as equal to the product of simple labor. Hence, it represents only a specific quantity of simple labor. Again, you may have a far more complex task, or you may have a far more skilled task, but that is obviously, it has a certain, it has a relation to what is called simple labor here, which would be, what we might call unskilled labor, or, the labor that is being remunerated much less, or that is easier to enter into in the marketplace. And there is a relationship structured there, and it's structured through even the exchange itself. You may have a skilled job where you're earning $200,000, but there is kind of a relationship there between, okay, you're earning so much with your highly skilled labor versus, the simple so-called unskilled labor, well, they're earning, X. So you also sort of socially relate to how much you're paid in that way. Like, okay, well, I have this skill that's worth so much compared to what people in this less skilled area are earning. And importantly, that's something that can also be transformed. Like, if your labor suddenly becomes reduced to something like, let's say, coding becomes a less skill intensive area, where it's easier for simple labor to enter into it, or where it's more possible to have coding as a simpler task done through human brain power in this case, then it is possible, you're going to see a sort of reduction in that value compared to, what is the pay for simple labor, the pay for basic unskilled labor. And so there is a relationship set up there, and they impact each other in that, if the value of all labor in general is collapsing, you're likely, even the skilled labor is quite likely to go down, or conversely, if there's increasingly intensified need for labor, for social labor as a whole, then that can be pushed upwards. The various proportions in which different kinds of labor are reduced to simple labor as their unit of measurement are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers. These proportions therefore appear to the producers to have been handed down by tradition. In the interests of simplification, we shall henceforth view every form of labor power directly as simple labor power. By this, we shall simply be saving ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. So again, here to analyze the capitalist system as a whole, we're going to be working with the most basic forms, abstracting to the most basic form. So in this case, basically treating with unskilled simple labor. Now, the process in which unskilled simple labor is mediated or relates to more highly skilled specialized labor, that can obviously take time, and there can even be entire historic periods where the market is not balanced in one way or another. But you can kind of see how capitalism moves to reduce that in one way or another. Like we've seen today over and over again, you're told, people are being told, oh yeah, you should go into the trades. No, don't go to college. The real money is in going to work in the trades. You should go to trade school. You should learn to become a plumber. You should learn to become an electrician. Basically because there seemed to be a need for that, and because many of the people running businesses that need that labor, they want to see the value of that labor go down. They want to encourage more people to enter the market there, so that it's closer to the value of simple labor. And this is something that previously happened with coding in different ways. Is that if you go back 5 years, 10 years, it's like all the time, oh yeah, you've been laid off. Well, you should just study coding. You should go to coding boot camp. You should, learn to code. That's disappeared now because we've had these transformations in the productive process around coding that the labor isn't as needed as it was before. But these sort of campaigns these are sort of campaigns to try to reduce skilled labor closer to simple labor, closer to the price and cost of simple labor, or something that it can be related to that. Obviously, it's an incredibly complex social process through time, through many decisions and through individual capacities and smaller and bigger markets for that to make itself felt and function as a whole over time. But the process is there, and the pressures within the proper market to create that equalization are there and felt all the time. And it's something you see. You can go on Reddit, you can go on the news, you can go on wherever, and they'll be telling you, oh yeah, you should study X, to get a good job. That's because you have, market pressure. You have capitalists that are sitting there and like, man, my labor costs are, way out of line with what unskilled labor is. So we got to get more unskilled labor to, be trained into working on this. All right, continuing from here. Just as in viewing the coat and the linen as values, we abstract from their different use values, so in the case of the labor represented by those values, do we disregard the difference between its useful forms, tailoring and weaving. So here again, to kind of abandon, for the purpose of an analysis, yes, there's all sorts of differences between tailoring or weaving or whatever niche labor you want to talk about here. But for the purpose of the analysis, you can disregard those specificities because those specificities are also resolved through this exchange, through this social process. They are reduced to their simpler, more fundamental aspects. The use values coat and linen are combinations of, on the one hand, productive activity with a definite purpose, and on the other, cloth and yarn. The values coat and linen, however, are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous labor. In the same way, the labor contained in these values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being an expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving are the formative elements in the use values coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities, but only insofar as abstraction is made from their particular qualities, only insofar as both possess the same quality of being human labor, do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of the two articles mentioned. So they have aspects that are different and unique, but they relate to each other only through what is common, and they are related to one another only through this common aspect, which is the subject of our study and of our analysis here. Coats and linen, however, are not merely values in general, but values of definite magnitude. And following our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the 10 yards of linen. Why is there this difference in value? Because the linen contains only half as much labor as the coat, so that labor power had to be expended twice as long to produce the second as to produce the first. While, therefore, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively, with reference to value, it counts only quantitatively, once it has been reduced to human labor pure and simple. So again, here, we experience the quality of a use value, the quality of how we're using it, the quality of consuming a glass of water, or of reading a book, or in the sort of act of our use, we are consuming the qualities and particular aspects of each commodity. But these commodities are related among themselves and related within our system of production as as if they have this sort of common aspect, this common value, as things which are quantitative to one or another extent, that have been reduced to this quantitative aspect of human labor. In the former case, it was a matter of the how and the what of labor, in the latter of the how much of the temporal duration of labor. Since the magnitude of the value of the commodity represents nothing but the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. Again, kind of resetting the same, based off of the amount of labor they're in, they have certain value and they relate to each other and are effectively in certain aspects, they become the same based off of, having this aspect of human labor, having this aspect of value as we socially determine it within them. If the productivity of all the different sorts of useful labor required, let us say, for the production of a coat remains unchanged, the total value of the coats produced will increase along with their quantity. If one coat represents X days labor, 2 coats will represent 2X days labor, and so on. But now, assume that the duration of the labor necessary for the production of a coat is doubled or halved. In the first case, 1 coat is worth as much as 2 coats were before. In the second case, 2 coats are only worth as much as 1 was before, although in both cases 1 coat performs the same service, and the useful labor contained in it remains of the same quality. One change has taken place, however, a change in the quantity of labor expended to produce the article. So here again, we're talking about that, if suddenly it becomes easier to produce, then that value relation changes and the prices pushed down in relation to the rest of the commodities available in the market to be exchanged with it. In itself, an increase in the quantity of use values constitutes an increase in material wealth. 2 coats will clothe 2 men, 1 coat will only clothe 1 man, etc. Nevertheless, an increase in the amount of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. This contradictory movement arises out of the twofold character of labor. By productivity, of course, we always mean the productivity of concrete, useful labor. In reality, this determines only the degree of effectiveness of productive activity directed towards a given purpose within a given period of time. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products in direct proportion as its productivity rises or falls. As against this, however, variations in productivity have no impact whatever on the labor itself represented in value. So again, if things become more productive, if you're able to produce things more, then there are more use values being generated. However, ultimately, the process of equalization within the market will mean that suddenly you're able to produce 2 coats for the same amount of labor power. That will eventually be reduced in terms of value to the point where, it was 20 bolts of linen equals 1 coat, but now 20 bolts of linen equals 2 coats because, that the value is the labor contained within it. Obviously, this in actual capitalist production is mediated through all sorts of things because you're not just having changes in productivity that come from nowhere, you're having changes in productivity that come from investment in machinery, investment in factories, investment in infrastructure, and all of those aspects. All things which, have money, have capital going into them, and that expect a certain return on that money and capital, that expect, a return on that investment, which is then in its own similar process becomes, generalized as a sort of more general rate of return, expected rate of return on capital. And that mixes with, these productivity innovations in labor and, obviously in actually existing capitalist production, there are different monopolies that intervene. Nike shoes aren't really a commodity. Nike shoes have a monopoly aspect and compete with, other shoes. But, there's a specific use value behind its, brand or the sort of social value that's been placed off of these individual brands that then enters into the calculation as well. So, Mac products get to be overpriced compared to others based off of all the labor that's gone into marketing to building up value, etc. All these mediations, but these are kind of mediations and transformations on top of these kind of fundamental processes. And again, Marx here is trying to analyze the capitalist mode of production by abstracting, by breaking it down to the cell form, by breaking it down to the cellular level, to seeing how it works on this fundamental level. And then once we understand that, we can build up from that to try to understand well, then how does that transform in practice based off of the many innovations and sometimes innovation isn't the correct term, but the many ways that capitalism and profits are pursued, built up beyond that basic foundation of how commodities relate with each other and how our labor is related throughout society and related to the labor of others and to the commodities that we ultimately consume. As productivity is an attribute of labor in its concrete useful form, it naturally ceases to have any bearing on that labor as soon as we abstract from its concrete useful form. The same labor, therefore, performed for the same length of time always yields the same amount of value, independently of any variations in productivity. but it provides different quantities of use values during equal periods of time. More if productivity rises, fewer if it falls. For this reason, the same change in productivity which increases the fruitfulness of labor and therefore the amount of use values produced by it also brings about a reduction in the value of this increased total amount if it cuts down the total amount of the labor time necessary to produce the use values. The converse also holds. So yeah, again, more productivity, more use values created, but less human value, less social value, less labor value becomes embodied within them. But this growth in productivity obviously means there are more use values out there, which then we consume, we use, and we satisfy our needs with. On the one hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense, and it is in this quality of being equal or abstract human labor that it forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in a particular form and with a definite aim, and it is in this quality of being concrete useful labor that it produces use values. So again, let's go through the footnote first as well. In order to prove that labor alone is the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared, Adam Smith says this: equal quantities of labor at all times and places must have the same value for the laborer in his ordinary state of health, strength, and activity, in the ordinary degree of his skill and dexterity. He must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his liberty, and his happiness. Wealth of Nations. On the one hand, Adam Smith here, but not everywhere, confuses his determination of value by the quantity of labor expended in the production of commodities with the determination of the values of commodities by the value of labor, and therefore endeavors to prove that equal quantities of labor always have the same value. Yeah, we've got one of these long multi-page footnotes, so get ready here. On the other hand, he has a suspicion that, insofar as labor manifests itself in the value of commodities, it only counts as an expenditure of labor power. But then again, he views this expenditure merely as the sacrifice of rest, freedom, and happiness, not as also man's normal life activity. Of course, he has the modern wage laborer in mind. Adam Smith's anonymous predecessor, cited in Note 9, is much nearer the mark when he says, "One man has employed himself a week in providing this necessary of life, and he that gives him some other in exchange cannot make a better estimate of what is a proper equivalent, than by computing what cost him just as much labor and time, which in effect is no more than exchanging one man's labor in one thing for a time certain for another man's labor in another thing for the same time. Some thoughts on the interest of money in general," etc. Note by Engels to the 4th German edition, the English language has the advantage of possessing two separate words for these two different aspects of labor. Labor, which creates use values and is qualitatively determined, is called work, as opposed to labor. Labor, which creates value and is only measured quantitatively, is called labor, as opposed to work. And then there's a note on the note here, important. Unfortunately, English usage does not always correspond to Engels' distinction. We have tried to adopt it where possible. So Engels was like, oh yeah, it's wonderful that English has this distinction between labor and work. Like, actually, well, no, it's not always as clear, the distinction there, but it is something that is tried to be used, and basically talking about these aspects of labor. On the one hand, you have labor, or in this case, as Engels is phrasing it in particular, work, a specific kind of work, which is specific sensuous activity, an activity of your senses and an activity of your muscles and brain and mind to produce something in particular that'll then be used with its own particular qualities, its own particularities, and then you have labor as general, labor as this generalized comparison with which we attempt to relate those things to another. We attempt to relate, the particular among so many particularities to develop an understanding of the common within it, of the common amount of labor that goes into those particular values. All right, section 3, the value form or exchange value. Commodities come into the world in the form of use values or material goods, such as iron, linen, corn, etc. This is their plain, homely, natural form. However, they are only commodities because they have a dual nature, because they are at the same time objects of utility and bearers of value. Therefore, they only appear as commodities or have the form of commodities insofar as they possess a double form, i.e., natural form and a value form. The objectivity of commodities as values differs from Dame Quickly in the sense that a man knows not where to have it. This is apparently, again, literary references throughout, but not all of them have aged as well for all of us. Here is a footnote pointing out false stuff, saying, why she's neither fish nor flesh, a man knows not where to have her. Dame Quickly, thou art an unjust man in saying so. Thou or any man knows where to have me, thou knave thou. From Henry IV. So Shakespeare, Marx is bringing in Shakespeare. Unfortunately, I haven't actually read Henry IV. I should really go through those like good BBC plays of most of the Shakespeare. But most of the Henry ones I've not seen, or not seen most of them in a long time. But yes, a bit of a joke here from Marx, but not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values. In this, it is in the direct opposite of the coarsely sensuous objectivity of commodities as physical objects. We may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish. It remains impossible to grasp it as a thing possessing value. However, let us remember that commodities possess an objective character as values only insofar as they are all expressions of an identical social substance, human labor, that their objective character as values is therefore purely social. From this it follows self-evidently that it can only appear in the social relation between commodity and commodity. In fact, we started from exchange value, or the exchange relation of commodities, in order to track down the value that lay hidden within it. We must now return to this form of appearance of value. So again, value is not something you can find or grasp or look at under a microscope. You can't, the value is, there isn't, you can't find it in anything, but everything we have under capitalism has a certain value. That value is a social relation, and it's something that only appears between these things in the relationship between the things. And we'll talk about this later, like what does that conceal? What are the illusions? That we are living in a world in which the values are mediated in relationships between things, and so the value appears to be between the things and not the actual labor that makes them, because you're only able to witness this aspect of value within the things when those things are exchanged with one another, when those things are exchanged against another, and so they appear as thus to be possessions of those things, even though there's no way to analyze any individual thing and see or find its value there. In fact, we started from exchange value, or the exchange relationship of commodities, in order to track down the value that lay hidden within it. We must now return to this form of appearance of value. Everyone knows, if nothing else, that commodities have a common value form which contrasts in the most striking manner with the motley natural forms of their use values. I refer to the money form. Now, however, we have to perform a task never even attempted by bourgeois economics. That is, we have to show the origin of this money form. We have to trace the development of the expression of value contained in the value relation of commodities from its simplest, almost imperceptible outline to the dazzling money form. When this has been done, the mystery of money will immediately disappear. The simplest value relation is evidently that of one commodity to another commodity of a different kind. It does not matter which one. Hence, the relation between the values of two commodities supplies us with the simplest expression of the value of a single commodity. So again, here we are stepping into money. We are going to begin to understand like how money starts to emerge as a thing, how it becomes what mediates this relationship of value that exists quite apart from money. So how does this happen? Well, it happens through a little bit of mathematics, as we'll see. It's not complex mathematics. Don't get scared yet. Where we want to get scared of the equations is in volume 2 or 3. That's where it gets scary. Here we're mostly dealing with, you know, x equals y. I know algebra. It's been a while. It's been a long time since we were in algebra class, and it scares us all. But the math as presented here is closer to almost kind of philosophical relations. You know, a equals x equals y. It's logic mostly. All right. The simple, isolated, or accidental form of value. X commodity A equals Y commodity B, or X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. Again, he's simplifying this and bringing this back to yards of linen, our favorite commodity for the purposes of this book. 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat. The two poles of the expression of value, the relative form of value and the equivalent form. The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this simple form. Our real difficulty, therefore, is to analyze it. Here, two different kinds of commodities, in our example, the linen and the coat, evidently play two different parts. The linen expresses its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. The first commodity plays an active role, the second a passive one. The value of the first commodity is represented as relative value. In other words, the commodity is in the relative form of value. The second commodity fulfills the function of equivalent. In other words, it is in the equivalent form. So sounds a little tricky, just like right off there, but you know, basically he's saying that there is a relation here structured in this equation of, you know, 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 quote. And basically there's a relationship of equality and value, but there's a sort of active and passive relation that we are understanding. We are using one to understand another commodity. We are using yards of linen to understand a coat. So a coat is worth 20 yards of linen. The yards of linen here don't really enter in as yards of linen. They enter in as a tool which we are using to try to understand the coat, to try and understand how much value is contained within the coat. Yeah, that's basically simplified as best I can, like what Marx is talking about here. You know, we are using one commodity to understand the other, and so in some ways that's not a relationship of equivalence. It's a relationship of like active and passive. One is a tool we are using to understand the other. The relative form of value and the equivalent form are two inseparable moments, which belong to and mutually condition each other. Again, they are the same, they have this fundamental sameness, condition each other, but at the same time, they are mutually exclusive or opposed extremes, i.e. poles of the expression of value. They are always divided up between the different commodities brought into relationship with each other by that expression. I cannot, for example, express the value of linen in linen. 20 yards of linen equal 20 yards of linen is not an expression of value. The equation states rather the contrary. 20 yards of linen are nothing but 20 yards of linen, a definite quantity of linen considered as an object of utility. So again, like if you take the commodity alone, then you can understand it, how it relates to others, how this value exists within it. Because, well, a yard of linen is just a yard of linen. A computer is just a computer. A book is just a book. You know, you have to have some third tool that you're using to dissect that object and to begin to understand, you know, what this value is contained within it. Because just left by itself, well, you're just left with the use value. You're just left with how you can use this thing. It's A equals A, basically. It doesn't tell you anything. The value of the linen can therefore only be expressed relatively, i.e. in another commodity. The relative form of the value of the linen therefore presupposes that some other commodity confronts it in the equivalent form. On the other hand, this other commodity, which figures as the equivalent, cannot simultaneously be in the relative form of value. It is not the latter commodity whose value is being expressed. It only provides the material in which the value of the first commodity is expressed. Again, so to understand this commodity, we're using another commodity, which is nothing more than a tool to understand that first commodity. But that second commodity isn't, in some ways, it isn't understood. It isn't like we're not understanding that second commodity that's being used. We're not understanding the tool with which it's being compared. It is just a way to express or understand the first central thing that we are trying, which in this case are the yards of linen. How do we understand the yards of linen? We compare it to other commodities. We use those to look at and understand the yard of linen, but we're not understanding those other commodities. They're just there to help us understand what we're trying to analyze in the value of this first commodity. Of course, the expression 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, also includes its converse. 1 coat is also equal to 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat is worth 20 yards of linen. But in this case, I must reverse the equation in order to express the value of the coat relatively. And if I do that, the linen becomes the equivalent instead of the coat. The same commodity cannot therefore simultaneously appear in both forms in the same expression of value. These forms rather exclude each other as polar opposites. So again, you can reverse the equation, but by reversing the equation, you're making one commodity the object of analysis, and you're reducing the first commodity. You're just reversing it. You're not necessarily understanding both commodities. You're just now using what you were trying to understand before as the tool that you then use to understand what you've newly placed under analysis. Whether a commodity is in the relative form or in its opposite, the equivalent form, entirely depends on its actual position in the expression of value. That is, it depends on whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed or the commodity in which value is being expressed. All right. So yeah, it's kind of restating the same thing essentially. We can't understand it without using the other. My cat is complaining. They are yearning for the use value of food. So I believe we will take a short break as I feed the cat. And then we will return here to dive into subsection 2 on the relative form of value. So let's take advantage to enjoy the use value of the commodities in our homes. And yeah, I will be back shortly. It'll be 2 to 3 minutes. All right, we are back. Get this set up, make sure everything's right. Okay, looking good. Have Pancake here. Pancake has gotten all the use value out of her dog food that she's looking for, and hopefully is ready to listen to Capital. The other larger dog was busy getting use value out of her own tail, which was there's no commodity there. Totally rejects the commodity form, that dog. Pancake, and then every small dog I have here are big. Like they only like certain toys. Especially I have a white dog, Chicky Pan, who's very She wants like all the toys, a very, very capitalist mentality, you know. She wants all the toys are hers. She wants like the nice nice commodified products sold in the pet store, sold at the plushie shop. And then the pancake is more she has like one or two types of toys she likes, but she's more active chewing on sticks in the park. And then the big black dog, she's like she's obsessed with sticks. She's all about sticks and just being in the park and chasing sticks. So the different levels of you know, incorporation into the capitalist system there. You know, the capitalist system can't quite incorporate Gacha, the black dog, because, well, she just goes for the parks and sticks. You know, you can't make money off of that. But, you know, Chikipan likes her fancy plushies. Chikipan likes she's got like a Pokemon plushie that she's been thrilled with forever now, and I should probably buy her another one because, you know, they bring her such joy. But yeah, so let's pick up here with subsection 2 on the relative form of value. So again, we're sort of building towards you know, understanding the role of money, and we were talking about you know, this sort of unequal relationship in the equality drawn up between different commodities. And it's an unequal relationship despite being an equal relationship, because yes, you are showing that one is equal to another, but within that equality, one is being used to understand another, and one is being understood. And this is also a very good example of you know, how Marx is developing this argument in a sort of dialectical way. You know, this is the method on display. And again, it's a method that Marx is writing out here and developing without ever having to use the term dialectical to describe it. And I bring this up because all the time on organizations on the left, you know, they'll have like a bad argument. They're trying to justify something they did that doesn't make sense, and they're just like, well, you have to think about it dialectically. Marx did not have to he did not have to trot out the term all the time, and his most important criticism here, he built it into the method, he showed it in the method, and did it in a way that makes sense and makes it understandable to you without even necessarily needing to have that, you know, specific background in understanding where that method comes from. So yeah, that's kind of a pet peeve I have to bring up with a number of organizations that use it in a less than honest way or less than accessible way. Anyways, back to the relative form of value. The content of the relative form of value. In order to find out how the simple expression of the value of a commodity lies hidden in the value relation between two commodities, we must, first of all, consider the value relation quite independently of its quantitative aspect. The usual mode of procedure is the precise opposite of this. Nothing is seen in the value relation but the proportion in which definite quantities of two sorts of commodity count as equal to each other. It is overlooked that the magnitude of different things only become comparable in quantitative terms when they have been reduced to the same unit. Only as expressions of the same unit do they have a common denominator, and are therefore commensurable magnitudes. Here there is another side note on other economists. The few economists such as S. Bailey, oh no, sorry, my cat is asking to come back. The cat doesn't want to miss any part of capital. Minnie? She wants to know all about the capitalist mode of production. All about the relative form of value. So only as expressions of the same unit do they have a common denominator, and are therefore commensurable magnitudes. Whether 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat, or 20 coats, or equals X coats, i.e. whether a given quantity of linen is worth few or many quotes, it is always implied, whatever the proportion, that the linen and the coat, as magnitudes of value, are expressions of the same unit, things of the same nature. Linen equals coat is the basis of the equation. But these two qualitatively equated commodities do not play the same part. It is only the value of the linen that is expressed. And how? By being related to the coat as its equivalent, or the thing exchangeable with it. In this relation, the coat counts as the form of existence of value, as the material embodiment of value, for only as such is it the same as the linen. Again, to use one commodity to understand another commodity, you have to make one of those commodities in the equation into the avatar of value, into an expression of value more than it is an expression of whatever particularity that commodity has. On the other hand, the linen's own existence as value comes into view or receives an independent expression, for it is only as value that it can be related to the coat as being equal in value to it, or exchangeable with it. In the same way, butyric acid is a different substance from propylformate. Here we get chemistry. We're back to high school chemistry. It's chemistry class, guys. Get ready. I think I got like a B- in high school chemistry, so we're gonna have some trouble here. In the same way, butyric acid is a different substance from propylformate. Yet both are made up of the same chemical substances: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Moreover, these substances are combined together in the same proportions in each case, namely carbon 4, hydrogen 8, O2. If now butyric acid were to be equated with propylformate, then in the first place, propylformate would count in this relation only as a form of existence of C4H8O2. And in the second place, it would therefore be asserted that butyric acid also consists of C4H8O2. Thus, by equating propylformate with butyric acid, one would be expressing their chemical composition as opposed to their physical formation. So again, he's basically saying, explaining the, bringing out the same kind of analogy. Like if you're going to use this one element to understand another element, it has to have that element within it. It has to be something that can be contained of X element, that can be filled of X element to a certain level in a way that's understandable and makes sense. If we say that as values, commodities are simply congealed quantities of human labor, our analysis reduces them, it is true, to the level of abstract value, but does not give them a form of value distinct from their natural forms. It is otherwise in the value relation of one commodity to another. The first commodity's value character emerges here for its own relation to the second commodity. By equating, for example, the coat as a thing of value to the linen, we equate the labor embedded in the coat with the labor embedded in the linen. Now, it is true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labor of a different sort from the weaving which makes the linen. But the act of equating tailoring with weaving reduces the former, in fact, to what is really equal in the two kinds of labor, to the characteristic they have in common of being human labor. Again, there's a bit of repetition here, because Marx wants to get the point, and it's a complex point that has to be engaged with and understood kind of over again. This is a roundabout way of saying that weaving too, insofar as it weaves value, has nothing to distinguish it from tailoring, and consequently is abstract human labor. It is only the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities which brings to view this specific character of value-creating labor, by actually reducing the different kinds of labor embedded in the different kinds of commodity to their common quality of being human labor in general. Here we have a footnote. One of the first economists after William Petty to have seen through the nature of value, the famous Franklin, says this: trade in general being nothing else but the exchange of labor for labor, the value of all things is most justly measured by labor. The works of B. Franklin, etc., edited by Sparks, Boston, 1836. Franklin is not aware that in measuring the value of everything in labor, he makes abstraction from any difference in the kinds of labor exchanged, and thus reduces them all to equal human labor. Yet he states this without knowing it. He speaks first of the one labor, then of the other labor, and finally of labor without further qualification as the substance of the value of everything. So here he's, kind of talking about how, some of these early works of political economy, and including in this work by Benjamin Franklin, is able to find that, those kind of things hinting at this understanding of labor as something as common, simplified, socially necessary labor, but it hasn't necessarily been drawn out and categorized and analyzed as it will be done here. However, it is not enough to express the specific character of the labor which goes to make up the value of the linen. Human labor power in its fluid state, or human labor, creates value, but is not itself value. It becomes value in its coagulated state, in objective form. The value of the linen as a congealed mass of human labor can be expressed only as an objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit, a thing which is materially different from the linen itself, and yet common to the linen and all other commodities. The problem is already solved. So here, let's sort of go through this again a little slowly to make sure we're getting this all. Express the specific character of the labor which goes to make up the value of the linen. Human labor power in its fluid state. Human labor power in its fluid state is basically the act of labor itself, the labor happening, being done, and then it becomes value when it is coagulated, when it has been put into a commodity. But before that point, human labor doesn't have value. It doesn't appear to have value until it passes through and into this other thing, into this object that contains the value and that can be related to other objects on the marketplace, and until it is coagulated. Like when it's living, when it's happening, it doesn't have value. It is only when it's become in similar expressions that Marx will use later, until it has become dead labor, until it has already passed through and become part of this thing, and it becomes something that is then expressed in this thing and how this thing relates to other things, which are also themselves bits of dead labor, bits of coagulated labor, bits of congealed, socially necessary labor time. When it is the value relation with the linen, the coat counts qualitatively as the equal of the linen. It counts as a thing of the same nature because it is of value. Here it is therefore a thing in which value is manifested, or which represents value in its tangible natural form. Yet the coat itself, the physical aspect of the coat commodity, is purely a use value. A coat as such no more expresses value than does the first piece of linen we come across. This proves only that within its value relation to the linen, the coat signifies more than it does outside it, just as some men count for more when inside a gold-braided uniform than they do otherwise. Here again, we have the sense of humor of Marx coming through, poking fun, of course, at the authoritarian aristocracy of his day, particularly the Prussian military officers and so on, who would go on parade in a fancy uniform and be counted as valuing more than other men, simply because they're wearing a certain external form, in this case, a gold-braided uniform. Let's continue here. In the production of the coat, human labor power, in the shape of tailoring, has in actual fact been expended. Human labor has therefore been accumulated in the coat. From this point of view, the coat is a bearer of value, although this property never shows through, even when the coat is at its most threadbare. So, again, no matter how much you wear it down, you're never going to find the value within it. You can't take anything apart to discover the value, but every object has it. Every object and its relation to others has value somewhere, and it's determining important social force, but you cannot find it, no matter how much you tear it apart, or try and undo it, looking for that value as a thing to be found there. In its value relation with the linen, the coat counts only under this aspect. Counts therefore as embodied value. As the body of value, Wertkörper. Despite its buttoned-up appearance, the linen recognizes in it a splendid kindred soul, the soul of value. Nevertheless, the coat cannot represent value towards the linen unless value for the latter simultaneously assumes the form of a coat. An individual A, for instance, cannot be Your Majesty to another individual B unless Majesty in B's eyes assumes the physical shape of A, and moreover changes facial features, hair, and many other things with every new father of the people. Again, for bringing it back to his hated enemy of the European aristocracy. For someone to be king, he has to be recognized as king and be king in the eyes of the people who see him and recognize him as such. In the same way, value is there, but that value has to be recognized, within the view of the other things. And it is being used; those other things are being used to determine how much goes into that, how it has to be bounced off, it has to be reflected off the, in the metaphor, in the eyes and minds of the people, back to the commodity form, that value has to be reflected, bounced off of the other commodities that are being exchanged with this commodity we are trying to analyze. Hence, in the value relation, in which the coat is the equivalent of the linen, the form of the coat counts as the form of value. The value of the commodity linen is therefore expressed by the physical body of the commodity coat, the value of one by the use value of the other. As a use value, the linen is something palpably different from the coat. As value, it is identical with the coat, and therefore looks like the coat. Thus, the linen acquires a value form different from its natural form. Its existence as value is manifested in its equality with the coat, just as the sheep-like nature of the Christian is shown in his resemblance to the Lamb of God. So again, to gain his punches in, as he develops it. Again, it's important to emphasize, yes, it's a work of political economy, but Marx is doing what he can to, make it entertaining, to bring in literary references, to bring in, sly comments, and, make it an entertaining work as best as he can as well. But again, we're kind of restating the sort of same fundamentals. It has this value that then becomes apparent in its equality, but you have to, they are related to each other. There is an equivalence, but also a difference between them. We see then that everything our analysis of the value of commodities previously told us is repeated by the linen itself, as soon as it enters into association with another commodity, the coat. Only it reveals its thoughts in a language with which it alone is familiar, the language of commodities. In order to tell us that labor creates its own value in its abstract quality of being human labor, it says that the coat, insofar as it counts as its equal, i.e. its value, consists of the same labor as it does itself. In order to inform us that its sublime objectivity as a value differs from its stiff and starchy existence as a body, it says that value has the appearance of a coat, and therefore that insofar as the linen itself is an object of value, it and the coat are as like as two peas. So again, it's emphasizing this sort of, transcendent element that the coat takes on, that it becomes, that it embodies value in this moment as it's being used to understand the value of something else. It ascends to a higher plane of existence. It becomes something pure because it becomes pure value, and so it also is like losing its individual aspects when it's made into this sort of commodity that's used to analyze others. The commodity which is used as the measurement of a value ascends, basically. It ascends from its earthly form and takes on this, almost divine aspect of a universal embodiment of value itself. Let us note, incidentally, that the language of commodities also has, apart from Hebrew, plenty of other more or less correct dialects. The German word Wertstehen, to be worth, for instance, brings out less strikingly than the Romance verb valere, valer, valoir, that the equating of commodity B with commodity A is the expression of value proper to commodity A. Paris vaut bien un mas. Paris is certainly worth a mass. Again, a Henry IV one. And yeah, so this is the book. This is Capital itself that we're going through to answer that question. So this is the Penguin edition of Capital. It is this one. We are following the PDF on the screen, but I'm going through the physical text because otherwise my eyes would burn out over the course of this. And yeah, here we're able to see, like, Marx is himself from a Jewish background, saying that I think maybe he could have used an editor to not do the apart from Hebrew side thing. I don't think it ages super well, but yeah, that gets into an entirely different conversation. Anyways, back to the text itself. By means of the value relation, therefore, the natural form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A. In other words, the physical body of commodity B becomes a mirror for the value of commodity A. Here we have another side note. In a certain sense, a man is in the same situation as a commodity, as he neither enters into the world in possession of a mirror, nor as a Fichtean philosopher who can say, I am I. A man first sees and recognizes himself in another man. Peter only relates to himself as a man through his relation to another man, Paul, in whom he recognizes his likeness. With this, however, Paul also becomes from head to toe in his physical form as Paul, the form of appearance of the species man for Peter. So, he's talking similarly, how do we understand ourselves as a human being, as a man? Well, we are able to recognize that looking at another person. Oh, that person is one of us. It's one of what we are. Similarly, the commodities are only able to recognize themselves in the mirror, effectively, or in the extent to which another commodity mirrors them, mirrors what they have. So they can only be understood externally through something equivalent but external to them. Commodity A, then, in entering into a relation with commodity B as an object of value, vedkorpa, as a materialization of human labor, makes the use value B into the material through which its own value is expressed. The value of commodity A, thus expressed in the use value of commodity B, has the form of relative value. So yeah, it's understanding the value and through another, and the one through which it is being understood takes on this form, what is being called the form of a relative value. It is being used as the instrument for which to understand the value of other things. Quantitative determinancy of the relative form of value. Every commodity whose value is to be expressed as a useful object of a given quantity, for instance, 15 bushels of corn or 100 pounds of coffee. A given quantity of any commodity contains a definite quantity of human labor. Therefore, the form of value must not only express value in general, but also quantitatively determine value, i.e., the magnitude of value. In the value relation of commodity A to commodity B of the linen to the coat, therefore, not only is the commodity type coat equated with the linen in qualitative terms as an object of value as such, but also a definite quantity of the object are equivalent. One coat, for example, is equated with a definite quantity of linen, such as 20 yards. And so, obviously you run into trouble if you want to make coats the expression of value. Well, you get to a point where it's like, okay, it's worth half a coat, it's worth a 20th of a coat. Well, that makes it difficult. So in some ways, linen is a better measure than coats because linen is more divisible. You say the coat is worth 20 bolts of linen. That's easier because you can say, oh, it went from 20 bolts of linen to 22 bolts of linen, or, it's down to 15 bolts of linen. It's easier to use for the relative form of value a commodity which is easily divisible in a way that can be understood, and through which the other commodities can be more easily understood. The equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, presupposes the presence in 1 coat of exactly as much of the substance of value as there is in 20 yards of linen. Implies, therefore, that the quantities in which the two commodities are present have cost the same amount of labor or the same quantity of labor time. But the labor time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen or 1 coat varies with every change in the productivity of the weaver or the tailor. The influence of such changes on the relative expression of the magnitude of value must now be investigated more closely. So, yeah, we've up to now been kind of analyzing this in terms of a static moment. This is at this moment, one thing is worth 20 bolts of linen. Well, what happens when we start to introduce time, when we start to introduce productivity to this moment? There are going to be transformations. It's, especially as what Marx developed earlier, this sort of socially necessary labor time. This is something that is developed across the entirety of human society, basically. So it's going to be pushed and pulled in various ways, and it's going to be, transforming and adapting in various dynamic ways that make it difficult to, sit down and be sure that, oh yeah, 1 coat is always worth 20 bolts of linen. No, that's going to change. It's going to change depending on, forces developing across the entirety of the world. So how then can we understand these commodities not just in the individual motion, but also as they're in motion through time? And so that's what we're going to step into now. Let the value of the linen change. Here, as occasionally also on previous pages, we use the expression value for quantitatively determined values, i.e. for the magnitude of value. If the labor time necessary for the production of linen be doubled as a result of the increasing infertility of flax-growing soil, for instance, its value will also be doubled. Instead of the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, we should have 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, since 1 coat would now contain only half as much labor time as 20 yards of linen. If, on the other hand, the necessary labor time be reduced by 1/2, as a result of improved looms, for instance, the value of the linen will fall by 1/2. In accordance with this equation, we'll now read 20 yards of linen equals half a coat. The relative value of commodity A, i.e. its value expressed in commodity B, rises and falls in direct relation to the value of A if the value of B remains constant. If we compare the different cases examined under headings 1 and 2, it emerges that the same change in the magnitude of relative value may arise from entirely opposed causes. Thus, the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat becomes 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, either because the values of the linen has doubled or because the value of the coat has fallen by 1/2. And it becomes 20 yards of linen equals half a coat, either because the value of the linen has fallen by 1/2 or because the value of the coat has doubled. So again, these are these sort of transformations happening between one another, and they can happen on both sides. If you have as one commodity linen, one commodity coat, a transformation in the value of either will transform the equation. And so, we're going to see as this develop, well, if you want a measure of value, you're going to want a commodity that's value is less likely to be changing. Essentially, you're going to look for a commodity that is more sort of stable over the long term to be used to determine the value. But that's kind of where we're going. So let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let the quantities of labor necessary for the production of the linen and the coat vary simultaneously in the same direction and the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, as before, whatever change may have taken place in their respective values. Their changed value is revealed only when they are compared with a third commodity, whose value has remained constant. If the values of all commodities rose or fell simultaneously and in the same proportion, their relative values would remain unaltered. The change in their real values would be manifested by an increase or decrease in the quantity of commodities produced within the same labor time. So here it's talking about, basically, we've established so that if you're analyzing two different commodities, if you're establishing one and the other, then you can compare one to the other, but you won't necessarily know, well, did the equation change because coats became easier to produce or because linen became easier to produce? Well, to do that, you need to introduce a third commodity. As Gacha Naranja brings up, that third commodity can be an NVIDIA 5070, which will be worth a great deal of bolts of linen. I don't even want to venture to guess how many bolts of linen you need to get a NVIDIA 5070. But if you introduce an NVIDIA 5070 as this sort of third component of the equation, well, now you're able to see a bit more even in what's going on in this equation between the two different things. And yes, as you mentioned, with intellectual property, this does not always work. But what is intellectual property? Intellectual property is a monopoly, essentially. It's a legally established monopoly to produce one thing or another. And so, what Marx is treating here is commodities. Like, how do we understand the development of commodities, the exchange, the production of commodities, which are all things that necessarily a commodity is something over which, there isn't or shouldn't be able to be established this kind of artificial monopoly that you have propping up certain individual products, which we see all over the place today under, later capitalism. But even then, there are pressures through which the commodities being produced at the base of the system make themselves felt through that. Yes, there is room for monopoly exploitation around your specific clothing mark, but you're still going to be affected by the price of bolts of linen. If you're making linen clothing, bolts of linen are going to come into the equation. And even your own monopoly practices, well, they're going to depend on certain amounts of labor that go into marketing, into even legal lobbying, different ways you deploy to try to make your commodity something that has value, not only as a physical clear use value, but that has value, as Marx talked about earlier at the start of this chapter, that has value in the imagination. So, a lot of modern marketing, it creates this imaginary need we have for, I need this mark, I need the Nike shoes, I need the Adidas shoes, that's what represents me, that's how I represent myself. There's a lot of labor that goes into creating that feeling, across the population. Labor that goes into the marketing, labor that goes into the data centers that transmit the marketing, and in all of those aspects, the commodity forms are going to make themselves felt to one extent or another. Now, you can obviously, there is room to extract super profits based off of these temporary monopolies and temporary advantages. But there are also pressures towards equalization in which this kind of commodity production will make itself felt over time. But like Marx Marx is seeking to understand the capitalist mode of production as a whole, and especially to do that, you have to understand the foundation, the base, which is this exchange and production of commodities. And then, once you've gone through the levels of abstraction necessary to understand that, then you have a foundation which you can start to build up and, try to understand things like, how monopoly profits are defended, how they're extracted, how financial derivatives and the modern financial system work, which is a whole nother huge, a big bolt of linen to get through, let's say. And yeah, so, but yeah, to kind of understand the social system, Marx wants to understand the fundamental laws that operate through it, and then once you understand that foundation, you can start to build out to other areas. The labor time necessary for the production, respectively, of the linen and the coat, and hence their values, may vary simultaneously in the same direction, but to an unequal degree, or in opposite directions, and so on. So one can become, more productive, another can become less productive. They can both go in the same direction, but to different extents. The influence of all possible combinations of this kind on the relative value of a commodity can be worked out simply by applying cases 1, 2, and 3. Thus, real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocally nor exhaustively reflected in their relative expression, or, in other words, in the magnitude of the relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of its value and the relative expression of that magnitude do not by any means have to correspond at all points. Again, it's talking about, some of the problem with this commodity to commodity comparison is that you're using the other commodity to understand the value, but it's mediated. It's like a mediated understanding. You're not really understanding the value there perfectly because it has to pass through something else. Thus, real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocally nor exhaustively reflected in their relative expression, or, in other words, in the magnitude of the relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of its value and in the relative expression of that magnitude do not by any means have to correspond at all points. Here he has another side note where he's going to refer to the vulgar economists. The vulgar economists have exploited this lack of congruence between the magnitude of value and its relative expression with their customary ingenuity. For example, once admit that A falls because B, with which it is exchanged, rises, while no less labor is bestowed in the meantime on A, and your general principle of value falls to the ground. If he allowed that when A rises in value relatively to B, B falls in value relatively to A, he cut away the ground on which he rested his grand proposition, that the value of a commodity is ever determined by the labor embodied in it. For if a change in the cost of A alters not only its own value in relation to B, for which it is exchanged, but also the value of B relatively to that of A. Though no exchange has taken place in the quantity of labor to produce B, then not only the doctrine falls to the ground, which asserts that the quantity of labor bestowed. So basically, this is Marx doing a sort of subnote, polemicizing against some of the contemporary bourgeois economists at that time who were criticizing or disagreeing, in this case with Ricardo, over the labor theory of value. In this case, he's polemicizing against J. Broadhurst, who is not someone you hear of these days, but there are many of these political economists that are sort of polemicized against here or used as structures on which Marx then built his own theory later. Mr. Broadhurst might just as well say, and here's Marx's sort of response to that argument by these bourgeois critics of Ricardo's labor theory of value. Mr. Broadhurst might just as well say, consider the fractions 10 out of 20, 10 out of 50, 10 out of 100. The number 10 remains unchanged, and yet its proportionally magnitude, its magnitude in relation to the numbers 20, 50, 100 continually diminishes. Therefore, the great principle that the magnitude of a whole number, such as 10, is regulated by the number of times the number is 1 is contained in it falls to the ground. So yeah, he's basically just saying that they're, this specific criticism of them is kind of, it's confused because it's not getting at, it's not getting at what that value actually contains. It's sort of stuck in kind of the forms through which that value is or was expressed. The equivalent form. We have seen that a commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use value of a commodity B of a different kind, the coat, impresses upon the latter a form of value peculiar to it, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen brings to view its own existence as a value through the fact that the coat can be equated with the linen, although it has not assumed a form of value distinct from its own physical form. The coat is directly exchangeable with the linen. In this way, the linen in fact expresses its own existence as a value, Verstein. The equivalent form of a commodity, accordingly, is the form in which it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. So yeah, understanding the equivalent form of a commodity, it basically, as we summarize there, the equivalent form of a commodity is the form in which it is exchangeable with other commodities. If one kind of commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats therefore acquire the characteristic property of being in a form in which they can be directly exchanged with linen, this still by no means provides us with the proportion in which the two are exchangeable. Since the magnitude of the value of the linen is a given quantity, this proportion depends on the magnitude of the coat's value, whether the coat is expressed as the equivalent and the linen as relative value, or inversely, the linen is expressed as equivalent and the coat as relative value. The magnitude of the coat's value is determined, as ever, by the labor time necessary for its production, independently of its value form. So again, Marx is being a bit repetitive here. We're restating, you're seeing the value for the other form, but there is this fundamental value underlying it that we're working to understand. But as soon as the coat takes up the position of the equivalent in the value expression, the magnitude of its value ceases to be expressed quantitatively. On the contrary, the coat now figures in the value equation merely as a definite quantity of some article. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. So here, we're using one commodity to say, oh, it contains within it X amount of commodities. So you got to Naranja. You see how this works well for actual physical commodities, as Marx claims, was the value of a significantly better video compression algorithm. Well, I mean, a significantly better video compression algorithm, there are a few aspects to that question. One would be, we're talking about a monopoly on the production and use of that algorithm, which is in a way something. Again, we're seeing this throughout capitalism as it is today. But what would actually be the cost to deploy that algorithm? And I think this is an important thing to discuss when we get to the possibilities beyond the capitalist mode of production and the limits of it. Like any digital product can be reproduced infinitely. Or close to infinitely. Obviously, there's like a slight amount of wear and tear on the Steam data centers and the internet infrastructure when you download something. But with digital and virtual commodities, we're dealing with something that can, for an infinitesimally minuscule amount, be reproduced on every computer out there. And so we have something that can be reproduced infinitely, potentially, but that's not how it is under capitalism. Am I saying that video compression has no value because it is digital? No, I'm not saying it has no value because it is digital. But what I'm saying is that digital goods, in particular, begin to pose. They actually begin to pose at some of the limits and problems of the capitalist mode of production. Like the algorithm itself is closer to a recipe. It's closer to a blueprint of something. The actual deployment of it doesn't cost much labor to deploy it in more areas. It doesn't cost more generally to use the better algorithm, or even to reproduce the algorithm. The algorithm ends up being effectively acting as like a monopoly product, which depends on these super profits. And obviously, yes, it takes time to develop it. But we, at that point, we're dealing with kind of a regulated and legally defended capitalism. Like there's an expectation of super profits. And so for how long is that secret recipe going to be guarded or defended? And these are things that are politically determined by the state, essentially, which is something that Marx did plan a future volume that goes into the state and that goes into those sort of further areas. But again, that's sort of like taking things to another level beyond what we're trying to understand at the beginning, to understand the sort of base of this capitalist production and of this of competition as it develops. And that's kind of thing around these intellectually protected commodities that we're talking about. There isn't really competition. There's not real competition being allowed to play out. We're dealing with monopolies. Now, there may be political arguments of like, oh, it's good to allow that monopoly to persist because, well, if that monopoly isn't there, the investment won't go into developing that new technology. And then you have another process where like, people have done, they complain all the time. U.S. businesses over the last decades have complained, oh no, China is, stealing our technology. They're producing the thing. They studied how we produced it, and now they're producing it as a commodity. They're taking what was our protected monopoly and they're turning it into a commodity over which there is now competition to produce within the world marketplace. So yeah, like with a lot of those things, and even you can point in an earlier period, to something like art, which is the example that a lot of people, the question of labor of value, theory of value, bring up all the time. Obviously, there's not just an easy reduction to simple labor for understanding the value of the Mona Lisa or of sculpture, or David, Michelangelo's David, all those things. But those are also things that, especially when you take it back to that time, like those aren't necessarily the base of the society. Like our society does not reproduce itself just based off of art. Maybe it will at some point in a future post-scarcity society. We might be able to, and maybe that existing in that post-scarcity society would allow us to, in the same way that entering into capitalism allowed us to understand the role of labor and how the value of labor underpins so many things in a way that wasn't obvious in previous epochs. If we enter into a future kind of post-scarcity society in which we no longer have this need for commodities in the same way, it may be that we can understand deeper things about the value of importance of individual art than we can under our current society, which is still largely determined by commodities. Obviously, there are areas where it's not commodities, but for most of us, we're dealing with you need food to eat, you need different commodities to survive, to reproduce yourself, and to have kids, to reproduce your social class. All of those things come in pretty often and form the kind of basis of our society and how it reproduces itself. That's not to say that like we don't have to understand the capitalist mode of production. We're trying to understand those kind of underlying laws around that sort of base of society. That doesn't mean it's going to allow us to understand perfectly every aspect that might be at what is called like the interstices of the system. For example, if we're talking about in previous periods, when there was still largely sort of tributary modes of production, feudal modes of production. Yes, you could have somewhere a merchant republic city that kind of existed somewhat outside of that feudal mode of production. It didn't really exist outside, but it existed at kind of interstices, what are called interstices, these sort of intermediary spaces of exchange and trade, that allowed it to take on some social forms that were quite different than like the prevailing, sort of broader feudal relations that were the sort of base of most of the society. Literature, what is the economic value of a poem? Again, that is something that we will be able to understand in a society, in a future society which has as its foundation poetry, which will be a fantastic society. That's the kind of society that Marx wants to see when we go beyond the capitalist mode of production, a society where poetry or literature or self-expression is really the foundation of how we relate to one another and how what we're able to do. Unfortunately, we are still trapped in a society where we are fundamentally, we need places to sleep, we need articles to consume, clothing to wear, we need to feed our children, we need also aspects of social reproduction, all the labor that goes into education, etc. So it's not that we're working with a universal tool for understanding everything. Obviously, there are ways it plays in. For example, to have poetry, you need a poet, and that poet needs to eat something. That poet needs to be supported by someone. And so depends on someone who is in the process of producing things, giving a certain amount of the surplus that comes from that production to sustain that poet and allow them to do poetry, which can of course create different interests behind that poetry. The kind of post-scarcity society we want to see is precisely the kind of society in which we could explore a lot more the particularity of all these things, the particularity of labor, the particularity of our experiences, of our production, in which we can create more literature, more poetry, or relate in these unique social ways. But we are still stuck in a capitalist mode of production where, above all, the vast majority of that society is forced to sell their labor in a form of very simplified labor, in a form of simple labor that you're going to have to, deliver Uber Eats or work at a fast food counter or work in a production line in a factory or sew together shoes, sew together shirts, sew together different things that are commodities are sold. And that's kind of the reality of the vast majority of the globe. So that's what Marx wants to do. Marx wants to go beyond that. But to go beyond that, first we have to understand the fundamentals of that system. We have to understand the contradictions within it, how that system's going to work. And then later, after we kind of understand that, we can start to pick apart some of the peculiarities or some of the different juridical and legal ways in which that system has managed to sustain itself. Perhaps in some ways it has managed to sustain itself in ways that do not actually, make sense or correspond to, rational interests. And, there will be a political dispute over that. There's even under different capitalist states, there are different, definitions of intellectual property or protections to it. The United States protects medication far more than, say, India does, where India has generics that they deploy more cheaply, more quickly. And sometimes this even ends up as disputes between states. Obviously, a large number of U.S. monopoly-based businesses are upset with Chinese manufacturers coming in and challenging that monopoly because they don't want to see their monopoly pushed back into this realm of commodity production where they have to then compete between different commodities. So I think obviously this is a complex theme, But we're not like this. This is a. I don't want to like this isn't a super universal theory in terms of like understanding. Oh, all poetry can be reduced to the value of simple labor or something like that. The thing is, we're not in a society that is driven by the production of poetry. We are in a society that is fundamentally driven by the production of commodities. And that remains the case even as we've, under the development of capitalism, we have ever increasing monopoly aspects of that, monopolies that are juridically protected by the state. We don't live in a society based off of the production of poetry. And there's like never one of the other like right-wing examples that goes around a lot around those who question the value of the labor theory of value. The other aspect that comes into it is they'll say like, oh, what's if you're dying of thirst in the desert, what's the value of a bottle of Coca-Cola? And there another thing enters the equation. Well, they might like to say or imagine like, oh yeah, well then the value of it is whatever the market demands. They can put the price on you want. But another aspect enters there. Well, if you're really at the point of death in the desert, and someone has the bottle of Coke right there, the value of it actually doesn't become any money amount. The value of it becomes their life. Because if you're gonna die of thirst, and they don't want to share that with you, you're just going to kill them and take it. Which is why why capitalism needs that state there. It needs that state power. It needs that police power. To maintain all of that. But yeah, I think with that point of digression there, I think we will return a bit to the text. And again, we're going to get to a lot of these questions more in depth as things go on. But again, Marx here is really trying to he's purposefully abstracting the system out as much as possible to try and understand the underlying laws. It's not that it's going to, there are different particularities or specific circumstances where it, may not be as easy to translate as others, but it's trying to understand the laws under which society as a whole operates and functions and reproduces itself. And, as mentioned, we are not yet in a post-scarcity society. Perhaps with the right political transformation, we could become that. But we are not yet there. And so we still depend on commodities and on the purchase and acquisition of these commodities to survive and reproduce ourselves and reproduce our society. So if we want to understand that and where that society is going, we should understand those fundamental laws. And then once we understand those kind of fundamental laws and contradictions, we can sort of try to move to then understand like, okay, well, how does this then apply when we introduce, the last 150 years of capitalism, which is, there's a lot within that to take apart. But you have to start somewhere, basically. All right. Where were we? Let's, okay. One kind of commodity. Let's go back a bit because I may have lost a bit our previous place in that longer digression, but we'll get back to it. Again, with one kind of commodity such as a coat serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats therefore acquire the characteristic property of being in a form in which they can be directly exchanged with linen. This still by no means provides us with the proportion in which the two are exchangeable. Yeah, again, it's talking about this. Sorry, I need to get some more water use value in here. Got winter too. It's winter here, so it's a hard time for the throat here in Argentina. Got high humidity. Got a cat on my lap. Have to get through all of capital. So yeah, again, it's talking more again, kind of being, again, a little repetitive on the sort of limits of understanding the commodity through another commodity. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats, because the commodity coat here plays the part of equivalent. Because the use value coat counts as the embodiment of value vis-a-vis the linen, a definite number of coats is sufficient to express a definite quantity of value in the linen. 2 coats can therefore express the magnitude of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the magnitude of their own value because they had a superficial conception of this fact, i.e. because they considered that in the equation of value, the equivalent always has the form of a simple quantity of some article, of a use value. Bailey and many of his predecessors and followers were misled into seeing the expression of value as merely a quantitative relation, whereas in fact the equivalent form of a commodity contains no quantitative determinant of value. So again, here you're seeing the value only through a never, but the value is still there. It's still something underlying to try and work into and understand. The first peculiarity which strikes us when we reflect on the equivalent form is this, that use value becomes the form of appearance of its opposite, value. The natural form of the commodity becomes its value form. But, note well, this substitution only occurs in the case of a commodity B, coat or maize or iron, when some other commodity A enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Since a commodity cannot be related to itself as equivalent, and therefore cannot make its own physical shape into the expression of its own value, it must be related to another commodity as equivalent, and therefore must make the physical shape of another commodity into its own value form. So again, you can't understand linen in terms of linen. You have to understand it in terms of something else that then allows you to relate it, and that then allows you to relate it to others. Let us make this clear with the example of a measure which is applied to commodities as material objects, i.e. as use values. A sugar loaf, because it is a body, is heavy and therefore possesses weight, but we can neither take a look at this weight nor touch it. We then take various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. The bodily form of the iron, considered for itself, is no more the form of appearance of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as a weight, we put it into a relation of weight with the iron. In this relation, the iron counts as a body representing nothing but weight. Quantities of iron therefore serve to measure the weight of the sugar and represent in relation to the sugar loaf weight in its pure form, the form of manifestation of weight. So here we're drawing a parallel with how we understand value and how we understand weight as well. Weight isn't. Somewhat similarly, weight isn't something that is just there in the thing. It's something we measure based off of the quantity of the thing we brought together. And to measure it, we have to do it in relation to something else. Now, there are actually, I think there's like a super secret bank in Europe where they have this is the kilo. This is the piece of iron that measures exactly perfectly what a kilo should be. And it's there. It can be brought out if they needed to. It's kind of based off of that we have the kilo is this amount of weight. So he's kind of pointing out the parallels here, and that weight isn't something that is just there within the thing. It's something we measure through this third thing, and something has to take on the form of that thing to be measured. Now, at this point, we've mostly forgotten that, a kilo is related to this specific, amount of weight that is guarded in the bank to be an exact replica of, what a kilo should be. But, that is kind of the origin of it. And it's now kind of been adopted. It's like, oh, well, this book weighs half a kilo. My cat weighs, how much does my cat weigh? Probably 3 or 4 kilos, maybe. My dog weighs 8 kilos. The bigger one, 20 something. But yeah, that's kind of, he's drawing a similar parallel to weight to how we understand value. And again, it's something that weight has become, we don't even think about it at this point. We don't think about, how weight was at one point related to this specific object that weighed X, but now it has become sort of universalized and understood as such. This part is played by the iron only within this relation, i.e. within the relation into which the sugar or any other body whose weight is to be found enters with iron. If both objects lacked weight, they could not enter into this relation. Hence, the one could not serve to express the weight of the other. When we throw both of them into the scales, we see in reality that considered as weight they are the same, and therefore that, taken in the appropriate proportions, they have the same weight. Just as the body of the iron, as a measure of weight, represents weight alone in relation to the sugar loaf, so in our expression of value, the body of coat represents value alone. So here the commodity takes on that sort of relative form of value, occupies a similar position to this piece of iron that defines what a kilo is. Here, however, the analogy ceases. In the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf, the iron represents a natural property common to both bodies, their weight. But in the expression of value of the linen, the coat represents a supranatural property, their value, which is something purely social. The relative value form of a commodity, the linen, for example, expresses its value existence as something wholly different from its substance and properties, as the quality of being comparable with a coat, for example. This expression itself therefore indicates that it conceals a social relation. With the equivalent form, the reverse is true. The equivalent form consists precisely in this, that the material commodity itself, the coat, for instance, expresses value, just as it is in its everyday life, and is therefore endowed with the form of value by nature itself. Admittedly, this holds good only within the value relation, in which the commodity linen is related to the commodity, quote, as its equivalent. The determination of reflection, reflexion bestimungan, of this kind are altogether very curious. For instance, one man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the other hand, imagine that they are subjects because he is king. Here, Marx has a note citing Hegel's Science of Logic. That's I've got it over there, the Science of Logic. I have not read it. It's a very difficult book, but it is one to be worked through eventually. Where the here he says, where the determinations of reflection are stated to be not of a qualitative kind, but determinantness, which are themselves relations. So again, differentiated from weight, it's something that's a social relation. And so how are we going to understand the social relation? How are we going to dig into it? And then we're using these different commodities, the one in the equivalent form as the reflection of it. However, the properties of a thing do not arise from its relations to other things. They are, on the contrary, merely activated by such relations. So here, this property is something that is in it. We, in this exchange, are using the other thing to activate, to understand it, but it isn't the two coats. The value that the thing has that's worth two coats, we're using two coats to try and understand that, but that's not the value. We're just kind of using the coats to try and grasp what this value is, but there is that value underlying what we are using to grasp it. The coat, therefore, seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of direct exchangeability by nature, just as much as its property of being heavy or its ability to keep us warm. Hence the mysteriousness of the equivalent form, which only impinges on the crude bourgeois vision of the political economist when it confronts him in its fully developed shape, that of money. So here comes money. Money is the fully developed shape of this equivalent of the ideal commodity, which has been transformed into the equivalent with which we can try to understand the value within anything in particular. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities, and with ever renewed satisfaction, reeling off a catalog of all the inferior commodities which have played the role of equivalent at one time or another. He does not suspect that even the simplest expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equals one quote, already presents the riddle of the equivalent form for us to solve. So yeah, he's talking about how different political economists have struggled with this, and would just go through reasons of like why, okay, ultimately, well, gold is the best. Gold makes the most sense because we compare it. It's less effective than these other things for determining value. And here, Marx is building the argument to say like, well, yes, it will go there eventually, but already the most sort of crude understanding, the most crude relationship gives us enough to understand this problem, to understand what's going on here. The body of the commodity, which serves as the equivalent, always figures as the embodiment of abstract human labor, and is always the product of some specific, useful, and concrete labor. This concrete labor, therefore, becomes the expression of abstract human labor. If the coat is merely abstract human labor's realization, the tailoring actually realized in it is merely abstract human labor's form of realization. In the expression of value of the linen, the usefulness of tailoring consists not in making clothes, and thus also people, but in making a physical object which we at once recognized as value, as a congealed quantity of labor, therefore, which is absolutely indistinguishable from the labor objectified in the value of the linen. So he's saying, like, as this commodity becomes this relative form, it's adopting a different kind of use value for us. It's no longer adopting the use value of being used to do the specific thing, in this case be a coat. It's adopting a different use value of being congealed human labor, of being this sort of realized equivalent of labor that we can then use to understand and exchange with other commodities that we may want to use or we may want to exchange. In order to act as such a mirror of value, tailoring itself must reflect nothing apart from its own abstract quality of being human labor. Human labor is expended in the form of tailoring as well as in the form of weaving. Both therefore possess the general property of being human labor, and they therefore have to be considered in certain cases, such as the production of value, solely from this point of view. There is nothing mysterious in this, but in the value expression of the commodity, the question is stood on its head. In order to express the fact that, for instance, weaving creates the value of linen for its general property of being human labor, rather than its concrete form as weaving, we contrast it with the concrete labor which produces the equivalent of the linen, namely tailoring. Tailoring is now seen as the tangible form of realization of abstract human labor. So if coats are seen as the universal form to understand and congeal human labor, then tailoring appears as true abstract human labor itself. The equivalent form therefore possesses a second peculiarity. In it, concrete labor becomes the form of manifestation of its opposite, abstract human labor. So this concrete labor, this specific task, in this case tailoring, is transformed into something else. The specific task, the specific labor, when we get to the emergence of the gold standard, all the specific labors that may be with mining and foraging and everything that goes into producing gold, then that becomes, instead of the specific concrete forms of that labor, which are very different in themselves, will have very different processes, are very different experiences. But as the commodity they produce becomes this sort of universal commodity of understanding, exchange, the labor around it becomes abstract human labor. It ceases to have that peculiar specific character and becomes this kind of emblem of abstract human labor, of all labor that we use to sort of mediate our understanding of the rest of human labor. But because this concrete labor, tailoring, counts exclusively as the expression of undifferentiated human labor, it possesses the characteristic of being identical with other kinds of labor, such as the labor embodied in the linen. Consequently, although like all other commodity-producing labor, it is the labor of private individuals, it is nevertheless labor in its directly social form. It is precisely for this reason that it presents itself to us in the shape of a product, which is directly exchangeable with other commodities. Thus, the equivalent form has a third peculiarity. Private labor takes the form of its opposite, namely labor in its directly social form. So yeah, it is kind of building off of that second property. With the third property, it's just saying, again, this no longer, in the same way that that particular labor is no longer this particular form of weaving, but becomes this abstract labor. That same process, that same pattern is work, and this private labor, this individual labor, instead is just becoming expressed social labor. It's being used as a mark of value that then expresses and understands labor in general, and which can be exchanged and used as a form of value as such. The two peculiarities of the equivalent form we have just developed will become still clearer if we go back to the great investigator who is the first to analyze the value form, like so many other forms of thought, society, and nature. I mean Aristotle. In the first place, he states quite clearly that the money form of the commodity is only a more developed aspect of the simple form of value, i.e., of the expression of the value of a commodity in some other commodity chosen at random. For he says, 5 beds equals 1 house. And here we have the original ancient Greek, which I'm not going to try and do the original ancient Greek, but it's translated for us all right, so don't worry about it. 5 beds equal 1 house is indistinguishable from 5 beds equals a certain amount of money. He, Aristotle, in this case, further sees that the value relation which provides the framework for this expression of value itself requires that the house should be qualitatively equated with the bed, and that these things, being distinct to the senses, could not be compared with each other as commensurable magnitudes if they lacked this essential identity. There can be no exchange, he says, without equality, and no equality without commensurability. Here, however, he falters and abandons the further analysis of the form of value. It is, however, in reality impossible that such unlike things can be commensurable, i.e., qualitatively equal. This form of equation can only be something foreign to the true nature of the things. It is therefore only a makeshift for practical purposes. Again, here it marks out that these quotations come from the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle therefore himself tells us what prevented any further analysis, the lack of a concept of value. What is the homogeneous element, i.e., the common substance, which the house represents from the point of view of the bed in the value expression for the bed? Such a thing, in truth, cannot exist, says Aristotle. But why not? Towards the bed, the house represents something equal, insofar as it represents what is really equal, both in the bed and the house, and that is human labor. However, Aristotle himself was unable to extract this fact that, I think I scrolled down a bit, this fact that in the form of commodity values, all labor is expressed as equal human labor and therefore as labor of equal quality by inspection from the form of value, because Greek society was founded on the labor of slaves, hence as its natural basis the inequality of men and of their labor powers. So here Marx is bringing up the argument, not that Aristotle wasn't smart enough to see that, labor was a common source, was the key common source of value here. But in Aristotle's society, in ancient Greek society, there wasn't really this idea of universal valued human labor because it was a slave society. So, obviously, slave society does not have universally valued labor. It has clearly distinguished particular labors. And is also a society that was, in its own way, also heavily dependent on small-scale production, peasant production. Athens, in particular, was a mix of basically slave production, which was key for the silver mines that allowed them to take off, and a number of other key areas. But also, there wasn't this universal subject of a worker selling his labor. So there wasn't really the social basis for discovering this universal labor as a commodity. Like for labor to be a commodity, you need a society in which people have to sell their labor. In ancient Greek society, you had a mix of smallholding peasants who had their own property, and so, were able to sustain themselves and, maybe sell a bit of labor, but wasn't fundamental to their life and reproduction. And then you had slaves who were obviously sold as a whole, as servants, as laborers, but who were sold as such. And so, there wasn't the selling of, X labor power, or where there was, it wasn't in a form that sort of defined the society. And so that obviously makes it difficult to, see labor as this universal aspect underlying all human production and human society, if you don't have this universal subject existing there as something to work through. So again, it's not that Aristotle wasn't smart enough, it's just that Aristotle didn't exist in a society that allowed people to, find this universal aspect behind value that you can see through labor. And part of the progressive aspect of capitalism is revealing this. It's revealing this kind of fundamental aspect to human labor and human relationship to nature and our relationship to each other, but then immediately works to kind of mystify this and make it difficult for us to understand. The secret of the expression of value, namely the equality and equivalence of all kinds of labor, because insofar as they are human labor in general, could not be deciphered until the concept of human equality had already acquired the permanence of a fixed popular opinion. This, however, becomes possible only in a society where the commodity form is the universal form of the product of labor, hence the dominant social relation is the relation between men as possessors of commodities. Aristotle's genius is displayed precisely by his discovery of a relation of equality in the value expression of commodities. Only the historical limitation inherent in the society in which he lived prevented him from finding out what, in reality, this relationship of equality consisted of. So yeah, he was able to, the ancient Greeks were able to point at a lot of things, but, often didn't have a society in which to, carry that through all the way. Like, infamously, there was, they were able to invent as a toy, a very basic steam engine, but obviously the metallurgical technology and the social relations weren't there yet to try and transform that into a railroad and, industrialize in any kind of way. But there were some pretty tremendous things that were able to be achieved, and also many of those things ultimately didn't survive the passage of time, because unfortunately most of our knowledge of ancient Greece comes through, basically the Platonist tradition and Neoplatonist tradition, who reproduced Plato's works and the sort of line from Plato to, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but, we don't have surviving accounts of many of the other philosophers who they debated against and were also active in that time. We just kind of have the survivals of those ideas, which were also kind of the ideas most convenient to people in the Middle Ages, for then understanding defending certain hierarchies. Like, Plato and friends sort of come as this kind of aristocratic philosophical reaction against the democracy of Athens and against the expressions of that. And this, of course, produces all sorts of ideas which are quite useful in justifying the later hierarchies of the Middle Ages in different ways. And so those are obviously the works that were reproduced and copied, whereas, many other works are lost forever for history. And, we don't really have a true grasp of, some of the philosophical opponents of Plato and Aristotle and all of those people. We just kind of have them reflected through Plato and Aristotle's work. Anyways, returning to the commodity form out of ancient Greece back to contemporary capitalism. The simple form of value considered as a whole. The commodity's simple form of value is contained in its value relation with another commodity of a different kind, i.e. in its exchange relation with the latter. The value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by the direct exchangeability of commodity B with commodity A. It is quantitatively expressed by the exchangeability of a specific quantity of commodity B with a given quantity of quantity A. In other words, the value of a commodity is independently expressed through its presentation as exchange value. When at the beginning of this chapter we said in the customary manner that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, this was, strictly speaking, wrong. Here Marx does a lovely thing where it's like, okay, we have this argument. Actually, it was wrong. Let me tell you why it was wrong. But a commodity is a use value or object of utility and a value. It appears as the twofold thing it really is as soon as its value possesses its own particular form of manifestation, which is distinct from its natural form. This form of manifestation is exchange value. And the commodity never has this form when looked at in isolation, but only when it is in a value relation or an exchange relation with a second commodity of a different kind. Once we know this, our manner of speaking does no harm. It serves rather as an abbreviation. So again, he's saying, we were wrong in saying that it has a value because it has a value only in relation to other things. And this is why we're going to use exchange value here as the real term to understand value, because that value, it has reality, but it only has reality in relation to other things. In isolation, it doesn't exist. And so a commodity doesn't really exist in isolation. It exists as part of all these other commodities with which it is related. Our analysis has shown that the form of value, that is, the expression of the value of a commodity, arises from the nature of commodity value, as opposed to value and its magnitude arising from their mode of expression as exchange value. The second view is the delusion of both the mercantilists and people like Ferrier, Ganil, etc., who have made a modern rehash of mercantilism. Give me a pause. Yes, Fat Wombat. This will be on YouTube afterwards. I will update. This will all be uploaded to YouTube, and I might cut a few areas. But yeah, the idea. Partly the idea behind all of this is doing something that will also have that sort of longer term value as well, where I'll be able to leave it on YouTube, and people will find use for it in the future going and forward. And of course, if everyone is in a Marxist talk with me and it's be like, oh, did you read Capital? Did you even bother to read Marxist Capital? And then I'll just slam them with the link to the 600-hour YouTube playlist where we go through with this. But yes, don't worry, it will be on YouTube. But also don't feel like you have to go in perfect order for everything. So I would say a lot of these chapters are good to take as a whole. But Marx himself in some later writings would say, for people having trouble with it, particularly since the first chapters are very difficult, he would even recommend to a few maybe you should start with some of the later chapters and then come back to the original chapters if it's presenting too much of a challenge at first, or if it's too abstract. Because in the later chapters, there's some more concrete historical aspects that then make it kind of easier to come back and understand these first parts as well. So yeah, all of that to say, yes, this will be on YouTube, but also no one should feel like you have to get through 300 hours of previous playlists to join in at any point. There are some parts that are easier to take when you're digested as a whole, but this is something complex and big and can be digested as you are able to. And I like to point to historically, there was the case of, it was talked about Russian workers, in the lead up to the Russian Revolution, they would have one copy of Capital for their study group of 20 or 30 people, and so they would tear each chapter up and have the chapters sewn together, and each worker would have one chapter at a time, and then they would finish and trade chapter and do what they could to work together to understand the text. Thankfully, books are cheaper these days, but attention spans are are more difficult to maintain these days than they were before. But yeah, all to say, take it as you can, and don't be afraid to not understand some things at first. It's a hard book. These are hard texts, and so you come back to these things. You learn new things. You experience other things in life that let you view it in a new way, and all of that helps. All right, we were talking about mercantilists, which, for those who don't know, the mercantilists were particularly a whole series of economists who had a sort of somewhat protectionist view of trade. Like they always wanted to build up a positive flow of trade for the country as much as possible in general. It sort of corresponded to these absolutist states. So, Louis XVI, the England under, it was a bit later in some cases than like England under Elizabeth, but it was similar sort of like absolute monarchy, and then, seeking to gain trade advantages within that, basically. And their antipodes, the modern bagmen of free trade, such as, so this is the delusion of both of the mercantilists and people like Ferrier, Ganel, etc., who have made a modern rehash of mercantilism, and their antipodes, the modern bagmen of free trade, such as Bastiat and his associates. The mercantilists place their main emphasis on the qualitative side of the expression of value, hence on the equivalent form of the commodity, which in its finished form is money. The modern peddlers of free trade, on the other hand, who must get rid of their commodities at any price, stress the quantitative side of the relative form of value. For them, accordingly, there exists neither value nor magnitude of value anywhere except in its expression by means of the exchange relation, that is, in the daily list of prices current on the stock exchange. The Scotsman MacLeod, whose function it is to trick out the confused ideas of Lombard Street in the most learned finery, is a successful cross between the superstitious mercantilists and the enlightened peddlers of free trade. So here he's sort of polemicizing against, early progenitors of those who would, basically just say, oh, there is no value, there is just, what it fetches on the marketplace. There is just the price it fetches on the marketplace, which is kind of abandoning the scientific task of trying to understand what this is. Now, obviously, it's a position that presupposes the modern marketplace, which, then creates a whole series of other problems, since the marketplace is something that has not always existed, as we understand and interact with it today. A close scrutiny of the expression of the value of commodity A contained in the value relation of A to B has shown that within that relation, the natural form of commodity A figures only as the aspect of use value, while the natural form of B figures only as the form of value or the aspect of value. The internal opposition between use value and value, hidden within the commodity, is therefore represented on the surface by an external opposition, i.e., by a relation between two commodities such that the one commodity whose own value is supposed to be expressed counts directly only as a use value, whereas the other commodity in which that value is to be expressed counts directly only as an exchange value. So here we're again talking about this relation in which, the commodity using to be a measure is only that abstract measure, it is only that unit of measurement. And then the other commodity, which is being measured, it loses that aspect of value that it has in the measurement, and it's being understood only in its aspect, its potential, as something that is a use value, something that you can use. So, you understand the hamburger for its potential to be eaten. You don't necessarily understand it in terms of its value, compared to gold, which is, instantly understood basically only as the value it represents. Hence, the simple form of the value of a commodity is the simple form of appearance of the opposition between use value and value, which is contained within the commodity. The product of labor is an object of utility in all states of society, but it is only a historically specific epoch of development which presents the labor expended in the production of a useful article as an objective property of that article, i.e., as its value. It is only then that the product of labor becomes transformed into a commodity. It therefore follows that the simple form of value of the commodity is at the same time the simple form of value of the product of labor, and also that the development of the commodity form coincides with the development of the value form. All right, so this is an important paragraph. So let's take some time to review it and go through it. So the product of labor is an object of utility in all states of society. Again, it's talking, throughout human history, obviously, our labor has transformed nature in some way or another. However, what is specific about our epoch, about the capitalist epoch, is that the labor which is expended in the production of something useful is then taken as an objective property of that article, like he says, i.e., as its value. It is only then that the product of labor becomes transformed into a commodity. So it is only under this epoch we are living in now where that labor is able to be congealed and understand, and the commodity produced of it is understood just as value, as value itself, and not as the specific thing in which that labor has been embodied. And that labor may have been, he starts with the example of coats. So the coat is no longer understood as a coat. The coat is understood as a measurement of value, and it has lost the aspects of it being a coat that it had previously. And this is something historically specific to our epoch and to the capitalist epoch, in a way that was not, always the case with previous societies and previous organizations of labor. So it's something that we need to understand as new, even as it's something that helps us understand the old in a new way. We perceive straight away the insufficiency of the simple form of value. It is an embryonic form which must undergo a series of metamorphoses before it can ripen into the price form. The expression of the value of commodity A in terms of any other commodity B merely distinguishes the value of A from its use value, and therefore merely places A in an exchange relation with any particular single different kind of commodity, instead of representing A's qualitative equality with all other commodities and its quantitative proportionality to them. To the simple relative form of value of a commodity, there corresponds a single equivalent form of another commodity. Thus, in the relative expression of value of the linen, the coat only possesses the form of equivalent, the form of direct exchangeability, in relation to this one individual commodity, the linen. Nevertheless, the simple form of value automatically passes over into a more complete form. So here we're going to talk about where it goes, which ultimately it will be going towards money, of course. Admittedly, this simple form only expresses the value of a commodity A and one commodity of another kind. But what the second commodity is, whether it is a coat, iron, corn, etc., is a matter of complete indifference. Therefore, different simple expressions of the value of one and the same commodity arise according to whether that commodity enters into a value relation with the second commodity or another kind of commodity. In Homer, for instance, he cites the Iliad here, the value of a thing is expressed in a series of different things. The number of such possible expressions is limited only by the number of the different kinds of commodities distinct from it. The isolated expression of A's value is thus transformed into the indefinitely expandable series of different simple expressions of that value. And here he's going to talk, again, this is scary, there's lots of variables being brought up, don't be scared. Z commodity A equals U commodity B, or V commodity C, or is basically, it's scary, but it's simple being what's said here. And here he also explains it with specific examples. 20 yards of linen equals a coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or 1 quart of corn, or 2 ounces of gold, or half a ton of iron, etc. So This sort of equivalent is then being expanded to explain the equivalent of across a series of different commodities. But of course, then that can become hard to keep track of, and so this, is all going to lead towards the development of, one commodity being particularly well suited to expressing that, which is where we are ultimately going here. The expanded relative form of value. The value of a commodity, the linen, for example, is now expressed in terms of innumerable other members of the world of commodities. Every other physical commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. Here we have a lovely long footnote digression. For this reason, we can speak of the coat value of the linen when its value is expressed in coats, or its corn value when expressed in corn, and so on. Every such expression tells us that it is the value of the linen which appears in the used values coat, corn, etc. The value of any commodity denoting its relation in exchange, we must speak of it as corn value, cloth value, according to the commodity with which it is compared. Here he's quoting Bailey and other political economists. Bailey, the author of this anonymous work, which in its day created considerable stir in England, was under the delusion that by pointing to the multiplicity of the relative expressions of the same commodity value, he had obliterated any possibility of a conceptual determination of value. Still, despite the narrowness of his own outlook, he was able to put his finger on some serious defects in the Ricardian theory, as is demonstrated by the animosity with which he was attacked by Ricardo's followers in Westminster Review. So here he's talking about, again, kind of historic debate within political economy, like attacks on Ricardo's theory of value that were pointing out this sort of expanded form where you're seeing the commodity then drawn up to all the other different potential commodities at that moment in the marketplace where it is worth those different values. It is thus that this value first shows itself as being, in reality, a congealed quantity of undifferentiated human labor. So here, seeing it across all these different commodities, it's clear that it is actually this congealed form of human labor, because you're seeing it universalized, essentially. You're seeing that, we're not just dealing with tailoring and weaving, we're dealing with picking leaves, we're dealing with picking coffee, we're dealing with mining iron, we're dealing with all these aspects of human labor. And so what is common among this is this abstract, socially necessary human labor. The linen, by virtue of the form of value, no longer stands in a social relation with merely one other kind of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities as well. As a commodity, it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the endless series of expressions of its value implies that, from the point of view of the value of the commodity, the particular form of use value in which it appears is a matter of indifference. So, here where we're drawing up this commonality between all of them, suddenly it seems like it's something else. We're less talking about a coat or yards of linen, but it's becoming clear that it's something else that is wearing the appearance of a coat or gold or iron or coffee. There is this other thing that can change between any of these, because all of these are then equivalent within it. And so it can, change form as easily as you change clothes, as easy as you change appearance, essentially. In the first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. It might as well be a purely accidental occurrence that these two commodities are exchangeable in a specific quantitative relation. In the second form, on the contrary, the background to this accidental appearance, essentially different from it and determining it, immediately shines through. The value of the linen remains unaltered in magnitude, whether expressed in coats, coffee, or iron, or in innumerable different commodities belonging to as many different owners. The accidental relation between two individual commodity owners disappears. It becomes plain that it is not the exchange of commodities which regulates the magnitude of their values, but rather the reverse. The magnitude of the value of commodities which regulates the proportion in which they exchange. So again, we spin it all out across all these commodities, and it becomes clear what is really sort of underlying each of them. The particular equivalent form. Each commodity, such as coat, tea, iron, etc., figures in the expression of value of the linen as an equivalent, hence as a physical object possessing value. The specific natural form of each of these commodities is now a particular equivalent form alongside many others. In the same way, the many specific, concrete, and useful kinds of labor contained in the physical commodities now count as the same number of particular forms of realization or manifestation of human labor in general. Effects of the total or expanded form of value. Firstly, the relative expression of value of the commodity is incomplete because the series of its representations never comes to an end. You can keep going forever and ever and ever. There's endless commodities, so how are you going to write it out for all of them? The chain, of which each equation of value is a link, is liable at any moment to be lengthened by a newly created commodity, which will provide the material for a fresh expression of value. Secondly, it is a motley mosaic of disparate and unconnected expressions of value. And lastly, if, as must be the case, the relative value of each commodity is expressed in this expandative form, it follows that the relative form of value of each commodity is an endless series of expressions of value, which are all different from the relative form of value of every other commodity. The defects of the expanded relative form of value are reflected in the corresponding equivalent form. Since the natural form of each particular kind of commodity is one particular equivalent form amongst innumerable other equivalent forms, the only equivalent forms which exist are limited ones, and each of them excludes all the others. Similarly, the specific, concrete, useful kind of labor contained in each particular commodity equivalent is only a particular kind of labor, and therefore not an exhaustive form of appearance of human labor in general. It is true that the completed or total form of appearance of human labor is constituted by the totality of its particular forms of appearance, but in that case it has no single unified form of appearance. So, yeah, basically it's talking about the limits, both in terms of having that interchangeability among all the different commodities listed out. You're dealing with basically an endless list in the same way that, pi is endless. And of course, other problems, well, we're in a changing world where there's changing amounts of labor that goes into this. So it's going to be very hard to understand that and maintain this, infinite equation and this infinite relation of infinite things to each other. The expanded relative form of value is, however, nothing but the sum of the simple relative expressions or equations of the first form, such as, again, we are returning to 20 yards of linen equals a coat, or 20 yards of linen equals 10 pounds of tea. However, each of these equations implies the identical equation in reverse, i.e. that you can use the original as the equivalent form, switch which is the equivalent form, and understand that original in terms of the other, basically. In fact, when a person exchanges his linen for many other commodities and thus expresses its value in a series of other commodities, it necessarily follows that the other owners of commodities exchange them for the linen, and therefore express the values of their various commodities in one and the same third commodity, the linen. If then we reverse the series 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, etc., i.e. if we give expression to the converse relation already implied in the series, we get the general form of value, in which all of these are encompassed infinitely and they equal 20 yards of linen. And here we are using linen as the universal form, but obviously this can also always be reversed. The changed character of the form of value. The commodities now present their values to us, 1, in a simple form because in a single commodity, and 2, in a uniform form because in the same commodity each time. Their form of value is simple and common to all, hence general. The two previous forms, let us call them A and B, only amounted to the expression of the value of a commodity as something distinct from its own use value, or its physical shape as a commodity. The first form, A, produced equations like this. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea, half a ton of iron, etc. The value of the coat is expressed as comparable with linen, that of tea, and it's comparable with iron. But to be comparable with linen and with iron, these expressions of the value of coat and tea is to be as different as linen is from iron. This form, it is plain, appears in practice only in the early stages when the products of labor are converted into commodities by accidental occasional exchanges. So at an earlier point in human society where we're, again, we're talking about like barter trade and things like that, where there is exchange that happens, of course, but it's not not at a very generalized level of exchange and not applied to everything. The second form, B, distinguishes the value of a commodity from its own use value more adequately than the first. For the value of the coat now stands in contrast with its natural form in all possible shapes, in the sense that it is equated with linen, iron, tea, in short, with everything but itself. On the other hand, any expression of value common to all commodities is directly excluded, for in the expression of value of each commodity, all other commodities now appear only in the form of equivalence. The expanded form of value comes into actual existence for the first time when a particular product of labor, such as cattle, is no longer exceptionally but habitually exchanged for various other commodities. The new form we have just obtained expresses the values of the world of commodities through one single kind of commodity set apart from the rest, through the linen, for example, and thus represents the values of all commodities by means of their equality with linen. Through its equation with linen, the value of every commodity is now not only differentiated from its own use value, but from all use values, and is, by that very fact, expressed as that which is common to all commodities. This becomes the universal commodity, the commodity through which you understand all others. By this form, commodities are for the first time really brought into relation with each other as values, or permitted to appear to each other as exchange values. Once you adopt this universal point, you're able to see more clearly the relationship between all of the others. The two earlier forms express the value of each commodity either in terms of a single commodity of a different kind or in a series of many commodities which differ from the first one. In both cases, it is the private task, so to speak, of the individual commodity to give itself a form of value. And it accomplishes this task without the aid of others, which play towards it the merely passive role of equivalent. The general form of value, on the other hand, can only arise as the joint contribution of the whole world of commodities. So when you take all of these commodities together, you begin to see this broader general form. A commodity only acquires a general expression of its value if, at the same time, all other commodities express their values in the same equivalent, and every newly emergent commodity must follow suit. It thus becomes evident that because the objectivity of commodities as values is the purely social existence of these things, it can only be expressed through the whole range of their social relations. Consequently, the form of their value must possess social validity. In this form, when they are all counted as comparable with the linen, all commodities appear not only as qualitatively equal as values in general, but as values of quantitatively comparable magnitude. So here they're broken, they're no longer having this both qualitative and quantitative difference. All the commodities are being reduced to a commodity through this value and begin to exist as such, and you can begin to understand them as such. Because the magnitudes of their values are expressed in one and the same material, the linen, these magnitudes are now reflected in each other. For instance, 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, etc., etc. Therefore, 10 pounds of tea, basically A equals B equals C, therefore A equals C. The general relative form of value imposes the character of universal equivalent on the linen, which is the commodity excluded as equivalent from the whole world of commodities. So basically, this commodity that becomes what is being talked about, the universal equivalent here, it ceases to be a commodity like any other. It becomes value itself. It becomes the expression of value. It becomes the expression through which all the other commodities are understood. Now, it remains a commodity as such, in a certain sense, but because the same thing goes into it. Particularly with gold at this point that Marx is writing, there's still all this human labor that goes into mining, refining, processing gold, but it has taken on this otherworldly aspect. It has taken on this other universal aspect of value, and it has kind of in ceasing to exist, it allows everything else to be understood. It allows the other commodities to then be understood through it, but obviously in a way that doesn't allow the obvious understanding of itself, because it has appeared different to everything else, even though it's the same, essentially. It has the sort of same fundamentals, but then its appearance has become differentiated, and so that's why to understand it, you have to do this sort of long process that Marx has done here of dissecting the commodity form and taking it step by step so that we can reveal what is behind this universal equivalent. So again, the general relative form of value imposes the character of universal equivalent on the linen, which is the commodity excluded as equivalent from the world of commodities. Its own natural form is the form assumed in common by the values of all commodities. It is therefore directly exchangeable with all other commodities. The physical form of the linen counts as the visible incarnation, the social chrysalis state of all human labor. Weaving, the private labor which produces linen, acquires as a result a general social form, the form of equality with all other kinds of labor. The innumerable equations of which the general form of value is composed equate the labor realized in the linen with the labor contained in every other commodity in turn, and they thus convert weaving into the general form of appearance of undifferentiated human labor. In this manner, the labor objectified in the values of commodities is not just presented negatively as labor in which abstraction is made from all the concrete forms and useful properties of actual work. Its own positive nature is explicitly brought out, namely the fact that it is the reduction of all kinds of actual labor to their common character of being human labor in general, of being the expenditure of human labor power. The general value form in which all the products of labor are presented as mere congealed quantities of undifferentiated human labor shows by its very structure that it is the social expression of the world of commodities. In this way, it is made plain that within this world, the general human character of labor forms its specific social character. All right, part 2 here. So we've got, going forward, so we will soon get to the fetishism of the commodity and its secret, which is perhaps a good part to pause for this chapter, as this is a very dense chapter. I don't think we're not going to get through the whole of it in one sitting, but we will get through to the end of this third section, and then we'll leave the fetishism of the commodity and its secret for the start of next Sunday, as we dive into that, and hopefully we also get into parts of chapter 2 then. All right, so let's finish this off. The development of the relative and equivalent forms of value, their interdependence. The degree of development of the relative form of value and that of the equivalent form correspond, but we must bear in mind that the development of the equivalent form is only the expression and the result of the development of the relative form. A simple or isolated relative form of value of one commodity converts some other commodity into an isolated equivalent. The expanded form of relative value, that expression of the value of one commodity in terms of all commodities, again, that equation we saw of all the commodities together equaling one another, and then imprints those other commodities with the form of particular equivalents of different kinds. Finally, a particular kind of commodity acquires the form of universal equivalent. In this day, he's talking about linen, but obviously the common one of his epoch was gold. And there were other periods in which silver adopted that, or different precious metals. Finally, a particular kind of commodity acquires the form of universal equivalent because all other commodities make it the material embodiment of their uniform and universal form of value. But the antagonism between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, the two poles of the value form, also developed concomitantly with the development of the value form itself. The first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, already contains this antagonism without as yet fixing it. According to whether we read the same equation forwards or backwards, each of the two commodity poles, such as the linen and the coat, is to be found in the relative form on one occasion and in the equivalent form on the other occasion. Here, it is still difficult to keep hold of the polar antagonism. In Form B, only one commodity at a time can completely expand its relative value, and it only possesses this expanded relative form of value because, and insofar as all other commodities are with respect to it equivalent. So again, it's talking about that expanded form where you're seeing how it equates to all the others, but obviously it's losing certain aspects of understanding itself when it's being equivalated to all the others. Here we can no longer reverse the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat without altering its whole character and converting it from the expanded form into the general form of value. Finally, the last form C gives to the world of commodities a general social relative form of value because, and insofar as, all commodities except one are thereby excluded from the equivalent form. A single commodity, the linen, therefore has the form of direct exchangeability with all other commodities. In other words, it has a directly social form because, and insofar as, no other commodity is in this situation. So it is, in some ways, stopped having its form as a proper commodity of, it has its use value, it has its exchange value, but this universal commodity is just kind of, it is value. It is the measure of value, and it's kind of lost itself in the process of becoming this universal tool. The commodity that figures as universal equivalent is, on the other hand, excluded from the uniform and therefore universal relative form of value. You cannot say, 5 pieces of gold is worth 5 pieces of gold. Obviously, it disappears. And in disappearing, it then, starts to seem like something else. If the linen or any other commodity serving as a universal equivalent were at the same time to share in the relative form of value, it would have to serve as its own equivalent. We should then have 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen, a tautology in which neither the value nor its magnitude is expressed. In order to express the relative value of the universal equivalent, we must rather reverse the form C. This equivalent has no relative form of value in common with other commodities. Its value is rather expressed relatively in the infinite series of all other physical commodities. Thus, the expanded relative form of value, or form B, now appears as the specific relative form of value of the equivalent commodity. So again, to understand that universal commodity, you have to expand it to where you're seeing it's equivalent to everything, and then seeing it's equivalent to all those things, you're able to see that aspect of congealed labor that kind of underlies it, of abstract and socially necessary labor time that underlies it. We also have a footnote here. It is by no means self-evident that the form of direct and universal exchangeability is an antagonistic form as inseparable from its opposite, the form of non-direct exchangeability, as the positivity of one pole of a magnet is from the negativity of the other pole. This has allowed the illusion to arise that all commodities can simultaneously be imprinted with the stamp of direct exchangeability in the same way that it might be imagined that all Catholics can be popes. Again, he takes his, he enjoys taking his shots at where he can. It is, of course, highly desirable in the eyes of the petty bourgeois, who views the production of commodities as the absolute summit of human freedom and individual independence, that the inconvenience resulting from the impossibility of exchanging commodities directly, which are inherent in this form, should be removed. This Philistine utopia is depicted in the Socialism of Proudhon, which, as I have shown elsewhere, does not even possess the merit of originality, but was in fact developed far more successfully long before Proudhon by Gray and others. Even so, wisdom of this kind is still rife in certain circles under the name of science. No school of thought has thrown around the word science more haphazardly than that of Proudhon, for wo Begriffe fällen, da stellt so rechten weiten Sort sich ein. Where thoughts are absent, words are brought in as convenient replacements. This is apparently an altered quotation from Goethe and Faust. Again, as said in the immortal lines of Disco Elysium, one of the most important parts of being a communist is criticizing other communists. However, it would be unfair to even consider Proudhon a proper communist. But this is a digression into other areas. But hey, it's a digression that Marx makes because Marx has to get his licks in the footnotes. Anyways, with that side note brought to us by Marx out of the way, let us go to section 3, the transition from the general form of value to the money form. So here we're going to get into the emergence of money. That is not the greatest translation in your opinion, one bet? Yeah, I got no idea there on the German. I've chosen not to jump into the German. And also it mentions that Marx himself is altering the quotation itself to fit things a little bit differently. So we're getting like three layers of translation here that get in there. But yes, thank you for the contribution there. Always, translation is a painful task. I translate things from Spanish to English sometimes as well, and it's always like to translate something feels like you're performing amputations on the text to try and make it decipherable, and it's a painful process. Anyways. Back to section 3, the transition from the general form of value to the money form. So here we are finally getting to the money form. The universal equivalent form is a form of value in general. It can therefore be assumed by any commodity. On the other hand, a commodity is only to be found in the universal equivalent form if and insofar as it is excluded from the ranks of all other commodities as being their equivalent. Only when this exclusion becomes finally restricted to a specific kind of commodity does the uniform relative form of value of the world of commodities obtain objective fixedness and general social validity. The specific kind of commodity with whose natural form the equivalent form is socially interwoven now becomes the money commodity. It serves as money. It becomes its specific social function and consequently its social monopoly to play the part of universal equivalent within the world of commodities. Among the commodities which in Form B figure as particular equivalents of the linen, and in Form C express in common their relative values in linen, there is one in particular which has historically conquered this advantageous position, gold. If then in Form C we replace the linen by gold, we get the money form. And now it has all those different commodities laid out, and they are equal to 2 ounces of gold, which appears suddenly as something we know as its price. This is kind of the money form. Now, obviously, we are now living in a world where the gold standard has disappeared ever since the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, which is a whole nother conversation. We won't get there yet. But you can see that this is a flexible system that Marx is laying out. And the post-Bretton Woods system, while it has abandoned the gold standard, it remains tied very heavily to all sorts of things in terms of U.S. treasuries, in terms of the holding of U.S. debt, and of course the world dominance of the New York Stock Exchange that have created this phantasm, this ghost of a goldless U.S. currency, which is what we're currently dealing with today, but which is historically something quite new. Anyways, back to gold. Fundamental changes have taken place in the course of the transition from Form A to Form B and from Form B to Form C. As against this, Form D differs not at all from Form C, except that now instead of linen, gold has assumed the universal equivalent. All we've done is change linen for gold. Gold is in Form D what linen was in Form C, the universal equivalent. The advance consists only in that the form of direct and universal exchangeability, in other words, the universal equivalent form, has now by social custom finally become entwined with the specific natural form of the commodity gold. Again, gold is its own commodity, but it has been transformed historically into this other thing. Gold confronts the other commodities as money only because it previously confronted them as a commodity. Like all other commodities, it also functioned as an equivalent, either as a single equivalent in isolated exchanges or as a particular equivalent alongside other commodity equivalents. Gradually, it began to serve as universal equivalent in narrower or wider fields. As soon as it had won a monopoly of this position in the expression of value for the world of commodities, it became the money commodity. And only then, when it had already become the money economy, did Form D become distinct from Form C, and the general form of value come to be transformed into the money form. So there's nothing big about this leap, but this is kind of the leap that happened My cat has shown up again. Very important. But it is kind of the leap that happened, which seems like a big leap because then it leads to, it leads to this whole room where a series of political economists will think, oh, well, gold itself is, actual value. It's not a commodity. And here, Marx is doing this whole complex structure of building out the history, building out the logical continuity, basically to culminate with this understanding that, gold is actually just another commodity, which was transformed into, this universal commodity, into the money commodity. But it remains at base another commodity, which is a product and a representation of a certain amount of congealed labor. The simple expression of the relative value of a single commodity, such as linen, in a commodity which is already functioning as the money commodity, such as gold, is the price form. The price form of the linen is therefore 20 yards of linen equals 2 ounces of gold, or if 2 ounces of gold when coined are 2 pounds, 20 yards of linen equals 2 pounds. The only difficulty in the concept of the money form is that of grasping the universal equivalent form, and hence the general form of value as such, form C. Form C can be reduced by working backwards to form B. The expanded form of value and its constitutive element is form A, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or X commodity A equals Y, commodity B. The simple commodity form is therefore the germ of the money form. So yeah, basically here, again, he's sort of showing how you can then work backwards from all of that. And, going back to the other forms talked about initially, and you can use that to, see how this is built up and how gold, especially in this time in Marx, took on this value of the universal commodity, took on, and so we got the price form. And, that would then lead to a whole series of economists, being concerned above all with the accumulation of gold within the country. Like a lot of the mercantilists in particular were very, very focused on that. But at the base, this gold is just a representation of congealed human labor. And so, that's basically where we have gotten from here in dissecting the commodity. So the next section, the final section of chapter 1, is the fetishism of the commodity and its secret, which is a little dense and is a few pages more. So we are going to save that section for the next stream.